Chapter 100. In the depths of the forest it was quiet. Separated by a clump of leaves, the black dog and the girl who suddenly appeared looked at each other. For some reason, Atsu looked a little nervous. It widened its eyes and stared unblinkingly at the girl behind the trees, especially when it suddenly raised its head and sniffed the air a few times with its nose. Atsu suddenly took a step back, and the hair on its neck slowly stood up. It let out a low growl and showed its sharp fangs to the little girl. A dog. The little girl behind the trees also looked at Atsu. She seemed a little surprised and a little curious. After a while, the branches and leaves suddenly shook, and then she walked out from behind the trees. She was like a fairy that had fallen into the mortal world, elegant and pure. With every step she took, the green branches and leaves seemed to sway gently for her. Her right hand was behind her back, and her left hand was at her side. She gradually showed a trace of a smile, as if she was naive, and walked towards Atsu. Roar! The growl in Atsu's throat suddenly became louder, as if it was full of wariness and hostility towards this beautiful girl. The girl seemed a little surprised. She stopped walking, but the way she looked at Atsu seemed to be a little more interested. After looking at Atsu with her clear and bright eyes, she pondered for a while, and then seemed to think of something and smiled slightly. Come here. The girl squatted down 6 or 7 feet away from Atsu. She still maintained the strange posture of her right hand behind her back, and then raised her left hand. Her skin was as white as snow, and it looked as delicate and beautiful as a spring onion. She waved at Atsu and deliberately lowered her voice, as if she was whispering to it. There was a trace of inexplicable strangeness in her voice, and she said, "Little dog, come here." Atsu stood there motionlessly, his eyes fixed on the strangely beautiful little girl, as if he didn't hear her greeting. The atmosphere in the forest was silent and a little stiff, but the girl didn't seem to care. She narrowed her eyes slightly, but her gaze seemed to be getting brighter and brighter. She looked at Atsu and smiled. Then, she stretched out her white and tender fingers and said to Atsu, "Little dog, are you feeling very hungry? Do you feel like you can't eat your fill?" Atsu stared at her, and made a muffled sound. He sounded angry and confused at the same time. The young girl smiled and squatted on the ground. Her voice seemed to gradually carry an indescribable allure. It was almost hard to imagine that this ghostly voice actually came from the mouth of a little girl who was only about 10 years old. "I can help you. Come here, I'll give you something to eat. A type of food that you truly desire but have never seen before." She smiled, looking as holy and beautiful as a fairy, but her pair of eyes seemed to be flashing a terrible and crazy flame from hell. Atsu hesitated, as if he couldn't make up his mind, but after a while, he seemed to be unable to resist the mysterious temptation. Finally, he took a step forward and slowly walked up to the little girl. It no longer bared its teeth, and the hair on its neck also calmed down. Occasionally, its tail would shake, but most of the time, Atsu still looked at the little girl with doubt and a little caution. A satisfied smile slowly appeared on the girl's face. She stretched out her hand and gently touched Atsu's forehead. Atsu made a subtle movement, and then heard the girl's voice become deep and ethereal. She slowly took out her right hand from behind her back. Eat. I know what you desire most in your heart is actually this thing," she whispered to Atsu. Light shone through the gaps between the dense branches and leaves. Suddenly, there was a sudden silence in the depths of the forest. The wind stopped, and the trees were quiet. It was as if the whole world had stopped. A smear of dark red suddenly appeared, smearing this part of the world with a shocking trace of blood. Right in front of Atsu's eyes was her right hand that had just appeared. Fresh blood dripped down, flowing crazily and wantonly, rolling along that delicate skin. It was a bloody hand dripping with blood that would make anyone tremble in fear. The strong smell of blood instantly surged through the depths of the forest like a tide. "Brother Lu." A clear call came from the ridge of the field. Lu Chen looked up and saw Exian standing there, and waving at him with a smile. Lu Chen threw away the tools in his hand, clapped his hands to shake off the soil, and then walked over. He sat down on the edge of the field and said with a smile, "Why are you here?" Exian smiled and said, "I have nothing to do today, so I came over to have a look." Lu Chen curled his lips and sighed. There's such a big gap between people. I, an errand disciple, work myself half to death at the foot of the mountain all day, and still don't earn much. You, on the other hand, earn a lot of money every few days. It's just that the divine disc in your stomach has a few more pillars than mine. Exian was originally squatting beside him. Hearing this, her cheeks turned red. She hit Lu Chun and said, "You're talking nonsense again." Lu Chun laughed. Exian looked around and asked, "Hey, where's Atsu? Doesn't it usually follow you here?" Lu Chun also looked around. Although he didn't see Atsu, he calmly said to Exian, "That stupid dog can't stay still. It likes to run around, and it likes to hide in the forest. It probably ran into some forest again." "I see." Exian looked a little disappointed, but soon a trace of worry appeared on her face. She said to Lu Chun, "Brother Lu, Atsu just came here not long ago. This place is big, and there are forests and ravines everywhere. Will Atsu get lost?" Lu Chun waved his hand indifferently and said, "It's okay, you don't have to worry." Exian looked at Lu Chun helplessly. She didn't know why this brother Lu was so confident. Anyway, if it was her, she wouldn't be able to do it. But now that they couldn't find Atsu, she had no choice but to suppress the trace of worry in her heart, and said to Lu Chun, "Brother Lu, have you thought about what you want me to do?" Lu Chun looked at the mountains in the distance. Without turning his head, he casually replied, "What is it?" Exian said, "Didn't you say last time that if you help me come up with an idea, I will promise to do one thing for you?" "Oh, that thing." Lu Chun seemed to have come to a realization. He turned to look at Exian with a relaxed expression and said with a smile, "Why are you in a hurry?" Exian shook her head and said, "Of course I'm not in a hurry. But that thing, you really helped me a lot. I want to repay Brother Lu." Lu Chun said, "I haven't thought about it yet. Let's talk about it when I think about it." "Okay then." Exian seemed to feel a little sore in her legs after squatting for a long time. She directly landed on the ridge of the field beside Lu Chun. Lu Chun looked at her and said, "Aren't you afraid of the soil?" Exian pursed her lips and said, "I'm not afraid. Back in the disorienting lands, I even rolled in the soil and water. Especially those insects, drugs, it's much dirtier than here." Lu Chun laughed. Exian glared at him and waited until he stopped laughing. She said to Lu Chun, "But I recently heard that Bai Chao Tang will be recruiting some people to do spiritual power cultivation. If they do well, they may not only get some opportunities, but they may also be able to leave this spiritual field at the foot of the mountain. I wonder if you're interested?" Lu Chun raised his eyebrows and looked at Exian with a trace of surprise. "You actually knew about this in advance?" Exian looked around. Seeing that there was no one nearby, she smiled slightly proudly and said to Lu Chun in a low voice, "Although our family has been average these years, there are always some brothers and uncles who have joined the Kunlun party. One of them is in Bai Chao Tang, and has become a follower of immortal Qian Deng. So, are you interested?" Exian giggled as she looked at Lu Chun, and said, "Those who do things like cultivating spiritual energy are either seniors, elders, or young and powerful geniuses in our sect. If they are fated, they will have great fortune in the future." Lu Chun looked at her for a moment, and suddenly laughed. He nodded and said, "Yes, of course I'm interested." "That promise?" He pointed at Exian and nodded. "Help me with this." "Okay." Exian nodded with a smile. Deep in the woods, the bloody hand flitted across Atu's eyes slowly. The scarlet and terrifying color of blood was like a sharp knife, causing its pupils to contract uncontrollably. The extraordinarily beautiful girl was gently stroking the fur of Atsu's back with her delicate, snow-white left hand. Her right hand was dripping with blood, filling the air with a strong pungent smell of blood. This strange scene was concentrated on her, making her look like a holy fairy, but also like a ferocious evil spirit. "Eat." Her deep and melodious voice reverberated through the forest. "You have the bloodline of the heavenly wolf. You were born to be different. How can ordinary food satisfy your appetite? Only blood, blood that contains spiritual power, is what you desire the most. Come eat." She slowly put her hand to the mouth of Atsu, with a strange smile on her face. She seemed to be looking forward to it, but also sympathizing with it. Perhaps there was also a little desire. Come taste this blood. As long as you have tasted it, one day, the blood in your body will awaken. Atsu's breathing slowly became louder. Its eyes seemed to be struggling in pain. It wanted to leave several times, but every time its eyes fell on the bloody hand again. After a while, Atsu's head slowly moved closer. It stuck out its tongue and gently licked the petite but demon-like bloody hand. The blood dispersed and melted into its mouth. The light in the woods quietly dimmed. Unknowingly, it was already dusk. Chapter 101. At dusk, when the sky was about to turn dark, the sunset glow was still hanging in the western sky, like a burning flame, radiating an unusually beautiful and brilliant afterglow. Stone Pan Valley was already a little dark, and most of the Oddjob disciples had already left. Lu Chun and Exian were still sitting on the edge of the field, looking at the deserted surroundings, but only the two of them were left. A long time had passed, and the sky was about to turn dark, but Atsu still hadn't come back. Exian was a little anxious, constantly looking around, and at the same time, glancing at Lu Chun from time to time. Lu Chun also frowned slightly, looking a little surprised. They waited like this for a while, watching the sky get darker and darker, and the last ray of the sun was about to disappear. The vast Stone Pan Valley was about to be shrouded in darkness. Exian finally couldn't help but stand up, and said to Lu Chun, "Brother Lu, let's go find Atsu?" Lu Chun frowned. "This valley is too big, and we don't know where that stupid dog went. Plus, it's dark, we can't find it." Suddenly, Exian's eyes lit up, and she said, "Could it be that Atsu ran back home by itself?" Lu Chun thought for a moment, and said, "It shouldn't be these days, it has been with me every day, and has never slipped away by itself. Oh, what should we do?" Exian was anxious, and it seemed that she was really worried. Just as she was panicking, she suddenly heard Lu Chun, who was next to her, say, "Look over there." Exian looked in the direction that Lu Chun was pointing, and saw that on the other side of the field, on a path that had become very dark, suddenly a black shadow suddenly appeared, slowly walking out of the darkness, and then approached them. The black shadow was not tall. When it got closer, it really looked like Atsu. But the strange thing was, Atsu, who was usually lively and energetic, even though he was lame but still loved to run, was walking abnormally slowly at this time. Step by step, it stepped on the field embankment, and the darkness silently surged around it, as if it had become one with its black fur. Only its pair of eyes faintly glowed in the dark valley, and it seemed a little different from usual. "Atsu!" Exian shouted with joy, and her previous worry suddenly disappeared. She walked towards the black dog with a smile, and at the same time, she opened her arms and said with a smile, "Stinky Atsu, I have been waiting for you for a long time today. Where did you go to play?" Atsu's footsteps slightly paused, and it slowly raised its head. When it saw Exian running towards it, it immediately stopped. Behind Exian, Lu Chun looked at Atsu's eyes, and then followed without saying a word. Ah! In the blink of an eye, Exian had already run to Atsu's side, squatted down and first touched Atsu's head with her hand. Then, as usual, she touched the fur on Atsu's back with one hand, and held Atsu's head with the other, and played with it affectionately. Her white skin looked particularly beautiful and conspicuous in the night. Her slender neck and cheeks were right in front of Atsu's eyes, and from time to time, she even leaned on it, accompanied by her cheerful and crisp voice. It seemed so warm. Atsu's pair of eyes stared closely at Exian's neck, which was very close to it. Its mouth slightly opened and closed, as if it was panting. Gradually, it opened its mouth again, like a thirsty traveler seeing clear and sweet spring water in front of it. Its snow-white sharp fangs were shining at the edge of its mouth, giving off a sense of coldness. Its head faintly shrank back, and then slowly stretched forward, as if responding to Exian's joyful hug, and slowly approached the girl's white neck. Sharp fangs and blood vessels that seemed like they could be broken with a single blow were very close. Suddenly, a hand suddenly stretched out from the dark shadow, passed through Exian's shoulder, and pressed down, covering the black dog's eyes. That pair of deep and serene eyes suddenly disappeared in the darkness of the night. Atsu's body suddenly shook, and its body trembled. The hair on its neck suddenly stood up, but it instantly calmed down. Everything happened so fast that it was almost invisible to the naked eye. In the blink of an eye, it quieted down again, standing still in the same place, letting Lu Chen's palm cover its eyes. "You stupid dog, where did you run off to?" Lu Chen laughed and scolded Atsu. His palm was still covering Atsu's eyes, and his body was also squatting beside Atsu, looking like he was covering Atsu's head. Then he turned his head and said to Exian with a smile, "But we are finally back. It's getting late, and there will be curfew later. It seems that we won't be able to play today. Let's go back." Exian hesitated for a moment, and then said with a smile, "Okay." As she said that, she touched Atsu's soft fur again, and said with a smile, "Atsu, listen to Brother Lu. I will come to play with you tomorrow, okay? But you can't just run out and come back so late again." Atsu stood still. Its eyes were still covered by Lu Chen's hand, and it remained silent. However, its mouth slightly opened and closed, and a dark light flashed past its sharp white fangs. "Don't worry, I will find a rope to tie it to a tree later, and see if it can still run away." "Oh, then don't. Atsu is so pitiful." Exian immediately protested. Lu Chen smiled and nodded, and said, "Up to you. I won't tie it up if you say so." "Hey." Exian suddenly became happy. She nodded and smiled at Lu Chen, then patted Atsu's head again, and turned to walk away. After a few steps, she suddenly seemed to think of something, and looked back. She saw that on the ridge of the field, Lu Chen was still gently pressing Atsu's eyes. A man and a dog were side by side, and their posture seemed a little strange. "Brother Lu, why do you always cover Atsu's eyes?" Exian asked loudly. "Oh, this stupid dog is not obedient. I have to teach it a lesson. I will bring it back later." Lu Chen replied with a smile. Exian replied with an "oh," turned around and continued to walk, and soon disappeared into the night. When the last remnant of the girl also disappeared, only Lu Chen and Atsu were left in the entire valley. At this time, the sky was completely dark, and darkness spread from all directions, completely swallowing their figures. In the darkness, Atsu was still standing quietly, as if it was waiting for something. After a while, it suddenly felt that its eyes were loosened, and then the palm that was covering its eyes slowly moved away. The face of the man in the darkness appeared in front of it, like a shadow in the dark night, blurry and indistinct. There was only a pair of bright but stern eyes, staring coldly into Atsu's eyes. Between heaven and earth, suddenly, there was a cold wind blowing. It was bone-chilling, as if it could freeze and solidify blood. Atsu took a step back, then slowly, gently lowered its body to the ground, like an obedient subject, bowing its head in front of a powerful king. In its mouth, there was a low whimpering sound. Lu Chen stared at Atsu for a while, suddenly stood up, turned around, and walked away. At the same time he said lightly, "It's late, let's go back." In a secluded valley, in a simple and deserted hut, Lu Chen lit a candle. The door was closed, and the window was tightly shut, so this lonely hut seemed to be isolated from the outside world, becoming a small world. Atsu was lying at Lu Chen's feet, looking a little sleepy and tired, but it didn't fall asleep. It put its head close to Lu Chen's ankle, slightly rubbing against it. Its long black tail would shake from time to time, but it was still unusually quiet. Lu Chen sat alone in silence for a long time, frowning slightly, as if he was thinking about something. After a long time, he suddenly bent down and sat directly on the ground. At the same time, he reached out and picked up Atsu, and put it on his feet. An inexplicable aura seemed to be faintly exuding from his body. Atsu twisted its body uneasily, but after glancing at the expressionless Lu Chen, it quickly calmed down and quietly lay in his arms. Lu Chen's eyes swept over Atsu's body, staying for a long time on its eyes, then suddenly reached out and opened Atsu's mouth. Snow-white sharp fangs were exposed in front of him, mixed with a faint, almost imperceptible smell of blood. Lu Chen's expression changed slightly. He loosened his fingers, then pressed his palm on the fur of Atsu's body, and slowly touched down. Under the fur, the black dog's muscles bulged a little, wrapped around its bones, giving it a strange sense of power. When his hand slid across Atsu's chest, Lu Chen suddenly stopped. through the muscles and fur. In the chest, there was a heart beating strongly. Strong, fast and violent, beating far better than ordinary beasts, and far better than his usual self. There was a trace of haze in the depths of Lu Chen's eyes, but there was not much change in his expression. After feeling the strange heartbeat of Atsu for a while, his palm slid down again, touching the back of Atsu's back. Suddenly, there was a little moisture in his hand. Lu Chen looked down slightly, and saw a dark shadow between Atsu's black fur. It seemed to be the remnants of blood that had flowed through, emitting a subtle smell between the dry and bloody smell. Then, not far away, there was another similar small bloodstain. Lu Chen touched it bit by bit, and pieces of remnant traces gradually appeared on Atsu's fur. Some of them were attached to the surface, and some had penetrated deep into the skin. Then they converged together, and finally formed a shape. Lu Chen's expression turned cold for the first time, and his gaze was as cold as a knife. He looked at the thing that was formed by traces of blood on the back of the black dog in front of him. It was a handprint. A handprint formed by blood. He suddenly covered it with his palm, and then found that the handprint seemed to be only half the size of his palm, as if it was a child's palm, stained with blood, and left this bloody handprint on Atsu's body. The night was getting darker, and suddenly, a cold wind blew by, abruptly knocking open the window of the house. The cold wind rushed in, and abruptly blew out the candle flame. The whole world suddenly turned dark. Chapter 102. In the dark, Lu Chen sat still, but Atsu suddenly stood up from the ground, stared at the window, and let out an angry roar. The cold wind blew past, and it was cold inside and outside the house. Inside the house, one couldn't even see their own fingers, and outside the house, there was a boundless black sea. Lu Chen lowered his head and saw a pair of green eyes right beside him in the darkness. They flickered with a strange luster, as if they were transparent and precious gems. At the same time, they also seemed to emit a cold and gloomy light. It was as if an evil spirit was silently staring at him. As if feeling his gaze, Atsu also withdrew its gaze and looked up at Lu Chen. The eyes of a man and a dog met in the air. After a while, Lu Chen reached out and gently touched Atsu's head and whispered, "It's okay." Atsu quieted down. Lu Chen stood up and walked to the window, looked outside, and then closed the window again without any expression. With a paw sound, the outside world was once again separated from here. The next day, the sun rose as usual, and the people in the mountains of Kunlun went about their own business as usual. Everyone lived according to their own path. As the lowest-rung disciples of the Kunlun party, they had their own lives, and that was to work hard every day to pursue the hope of becoming immortals in the future. Even if the hope was very slim, everyone in the world worked hard for that hope. The legendary stories of the lowest-rung disciples turning the tide and finally becoming saints and immortals were still passed down in the world today. After thousands of years, they still hadn't disappeared. Instead, they became more and more magnificent, inspiring generation after generation of Rung disciples to dedicate their lives to this. When the sun shone on Shirpan Valley, Lu Chen also arrived with Atsu. There was no lack of people who came earlier than him, so at this moment, there were already figures working in the large spiritual fields. As for Exian, who vowed to come and play with them again yesterday, she was still nowhere to be seen. Maybe she was still sleeping in her warm bed. Compared with last night's abnormality, Atsu seemed to have completely recovered after a night's sleep. Following closely behind Lu Chen, it limped around, sniffed, and looked no different from usual. Lu Chen also acted as if nothing had happened last night. He calmly did his own things. After arriving at the spiritual field, he went down to the field and didn't pay much attention to Atsu. Of course, he didn't find a rope to tie Atsu to a tree like what he told Exian yesterday. In the beginning, Atsu was still playing around Lu Chen's spiritual field. However, after playing for a while, it became a little bored. After looking around for a while, it barked at Lu Chen twice. Lu Chen didn't look back, as if he didn't hear it. Atsu hesitated for a while, then ran away by itself. Nowadays, Atsu was very familiar with the Shirpan Valley. The crisscrossed ridges of the fields were no problem for it. Soon it ran out of the spiritual field and came to the edge of the forest. However, as it walked, the forest appeared in front of it again. It stood silently in front of the black dog. Atsu was obviously a little hesitant. After hesitating for a while, it lay down on the ground and stood up again. After walking a few rounds, it finally slowly walked into the forest. This forest was very cold. The deeper it went, the quieter it became. Gradually, it seemed that even the sound of birds could not be heard. The forest should be full of vitality, but for some reason, it gave people a sense of coldness and desolation. Atsu walked slowly, his pair of dog eyes looking around vigilantly, as if he was very careful. After walking for a while, it suddenly stopped and looked around. It found that this was the place where it met the mysterious little girl yesterday. Woof woof woof, Atsu barked twice. A gentle breeze blew through the forest, and the green leaves swayed gently, but no one responded. Atsu waited for a while. It seemed to be a little confused, but it also seemed to be relieved. It turned around and was ready to leave. However, at this moment, a low laugh suddenly came from the depths of the forest. The voice was clear and melodious, like a wind chime gently swaying in the breeze. The person was not there, but it was already a beautiful picture. After a moment, the voice was soft, drifting with the wind. "Puppy, come." Atsu widened its eyes and looked at the dense trees in the depths of the forest. After a moment of hesitation, it still walked over. A few fresh green leaves that had yet to wither strangely fell from the tree overhead. The leaves swayed slightly, and a moment later, a beautiful and immature face of a little girl appeared from behind the leaves. She looked at Atsu with interest and giggled. Her eyes flashed with a strange light, like the eyes of a snake, beautiful and dangerous. Or, because of the danger, there was a strange beauty. Atsu suddenly stopped and raised its nose to sniff the air. There was the smell of blood. It was much stronger than yesterday. "You smell it?" The little girl looked at Atsu and smiled. Then she stretched out her white and tender left hand and waved at it. "Come here, I'll show you something." Atsu hesitated for a moment and stared at the little girl. For some reason, it did not continue to move forward. The girl seemed a little surprised. After thinking for a while, the smile on her lips seemed to be a little wider. She did not say anything more, and just slowly pushed the branches and leaves in front of her. A blood-red light flashed in front of it in an instant, and the smell of blood in the air became thicker. "Come here, don't you like the smell of blood the most?" The beautiful girl's soft voice seemed to be inexplicably tempting. "Don't be afraid, you were born to drink blood. Come here, come here." Atsu's body began to tremble slowly, and its eyes flickered with a strange light. But at this moment, suddenly, on the other side of the forest, someone suddenly snorted. Suddenly, a black shadow flashed, like a ghost, and swept into the back of the forest in a blink of an eye. It was Luchin. A cry of surprise suddenly came from the back of the forest. Atsu was also stunned on the spot, as if it was dumbfounded for a moment. And in this short span of a few breaths, there was a series of muffled sounds. No one knew what was happening behind the thicket, but after a while, there was a sudden roar, and a large tree was directly snapped in half. The entire thicket came crashing down. The incomparably strong smell of blood instantly hit them in the face, and the dark red color soared into the air. On the ground behind the forest, there was an unrecognizable beast lying on the ground. At this moment, it was already dead. What was unbearable to look at was that the corpse was covered with cuts and bruises. No one knew how many wounds it had been cut, and blood flowed everywhere. Two figures turned over from behind the forest and entangled with each other. They suddenly started fighting fiercely. It was Lu Chen and the little girl who seemed to be just over 10 years old. What made one speechless was that in this small space, both of their moves were exceptionally vicious. Strangling the throat, gouging the eyes, hammering the chest and hitting the groin. Every move and every style were aimed at the vital parts of the body. But one by one they were neutralized by the opponent, and then they would be greeted with even tougher and more terrifying killing moves. This kind of fighting style completely lacked the elegance and nobility of a normal cultivator displaying their supernatural powers. There was not even the slightest bit of the legendary celestial bearing. How was this the Kunlun Mountains of a famous cultivation sect? This was clearly the most despicable and vicious killer in the mortal world. The most shocking thing was that the little girl was obviously very young. but she was so ferocious that it made people's hair stand on end. She was even no weaker than Lu Chen. But in the end, Lu Chen seemed to have the upper hand. It was not because of his viciousness and profound skills, but in this strange yet exceptionally dangerous close combat, the little girl's strength after sustaining for a while, finally weakened. The beast's blood stained their bodies, and even the girl's beautiful face was stained with blood, making her look even more ferocious and ferocious. She panted fiercely. Both her hands were grabbed by Lu Chen. Suddenly she screamed and directly used her teeth to bite Lu Chen's throat. This time Lu Chen was caught unprepared. He groaned in pain and felt a burst of pain coming from his neck. With a roar, he suddenly lifted his leg and heavily kicked that girl's abdomen. The girl cried out involuntarily. Her entire body was sent flying by the impact, but she floated in the wind for a while. She trembled at first, but she quickly restrained herself. Like a feather, she landed directly on a tree trunk, and then silently slid down. Like a ferocious cub, her face was stained with blood, her eyes filled with murderous intent. Panting heavily, she coldly looked at Lu Chen. Lu Chen reached out and touched his neck. His hand was wet. When he put it in front of his eyes, half of his palm was covered in blood. He raised his head and glanced at the girl not far away. Then, without changing his expression, he tore off a piece of his robe, wrapped it around his neck, and tied a knot. "You're even fiercer than a dog," Lu Chen said. The girl narrowed her eyes slightly, and a dangerous light flashed in the depths of her eyes. Suddenly, her body shot out like a spring, but she did not pounce on Lu Chen. Instead, she strangely rushed towards the black dog standing on the side. The sound of the wind was fierce, and the momentum was like a knife, as if it would tear Atsu apart in the next moment. This caused the black dog's body to curl up and retreat in fear. At this moment, Lu Chen's figure suddenly cut in from the side. In an instant, he knocked away the terrifying girl in midair. At the same time he shouted, "Run, Atsu!" Atsu was still in a state of shock. It subconsciously tucked its tail between its legs, turned around and fled. In the blink of an eye, it had run far away and disappeared into the forest. However, perhaps because it was too panicked, the stupid dog ran in the wrong direction. Instead of running out of the forest, it rushed deeper into the forest. The figures in the air separated and landed on the ground. Both of them groaned in pain at the same time. Blood flowed from Lu Chen's neck again. The piece of cloth that had just been tied around his neck had disappeared, revealing the terrible wound. At the same time, there were 3 shocking claw marks. He had been attacked by the girl just now. After the girl landed on the ground, she staggered 3 steps back. Her beautiful eyebrows were tightly knitted together, and she sucked in a breath of cold air. She clutched her lower abdomen tightly with her hands. Between the gaps of her white, jade-like fingers, dark red blood slowly seeped out. Among the bloodstains under her clothes, there was a vague, bloody wound. It was a sword wound. It was a wound that had been ruthlessly stabbed by a sword. It was a merciless, murderous wound. In the midst of the blood, her face became pale. Chapter 103. She raised her head to look at Lu Chen, and finally her eyes fell on Lu Chen's hand. There seemed to be an afterimage of a black dagger passing by, and then quickly disappearing, as if it had always been empty. The girl's cheeks became increasingly pale, and more blood flowed out of her lower abdomen, dyeing her fingers red. Only her eyes were still sharp and fierce, with a trace of coldness, coldly looking at Lu Chen. After a moment, she suddenly opened her mouth and said, "I'm only 10 years old, and you actually dare to do this to me?" Lu Chen's expression did not change in the slightest and said, "I just don't want to die." "Bah," the girl sneered. "You're a man, yet you still have so many excuses to bully me. Do you really not feel embarrassed?" Lu Chen did not answer her, and after looking at her thoughtfully for a moment, he suddenly walked towards the girl. The girl suddenly seemed a little nervous, and her body shrank back a little, and suddenly shouted, "You can't kill me." Lu Chen stood in front of her, and looked at the girl whose height did not even reach his chest. For a moment, he also felt that it was unreal. No one would have thought that this girl, who was as beautiful as a fairy, would actually have such a dangerous and cruel side. The scene of seeing her at the Kunlun mountain gate that day flashed in his mind. Lu Chen's heart moved and he frowned. Why? I have a great background. If you dare to touch me, you're dead. The girl fiercely threatened him. Lu Chen raised his eyebrows, as if he was a little interested, and said, Oh, so powerful? Tell me. The girl seemed to hesitate for a moment, but glanced at Lu Chen's eyes that seemed to vaguely become a little cold, and hurriedly said, I'm about to become Hakushin Jinkuin's third prodisciple. Ha! This time Lu Chen was really shocked, and he couldn't help but size up the girl again. What kind of person was Hakushin Jinkuin? In the Kunlun party, he was a peerless master who stood side by side with Lord Tianlan. Even the current leader of the Kunlun party, Immortal Idol Month, was only his eldest disciple. Everyone knew that Hakushin Jinkuin only had 2 disciples. One was Jinren Idol Month, and the other was Jin Dan Friarzhuoxian. In the past 60 years, no one in the Kunlun party had ever heard of Hakushin Jinkuin having the thought of accepting a disciple. That was a perfected cultivator of the soul formation level, the most powerful figure in the cultivation world of the divine land. A 10-year-old girl actually dared to say that she wanted to become a disciple of a true monarch? Lu Chen's first reaction was that the girl was lying. But soon he suddenly remembered a piece of news that old Ma had told him in private in Kunwa City that day. He frowned and took a step forward, almost within reach of her. He stared into the girl's eyes and said, Could it be that you're the legendary genius of the 5 pillars that only appears once in 1,000 years? The girl was startled. She seemed a little surprised, but then she said with a bit of arrogance, Yes, it's me. Now you know that I didn't lie to you. Before she finished speaking, Lu Chen suddenly raised his hand and struck the back of the girl's head. Immediately, the girl's beautiful face turned pale. She let out a low groan and her body fell forward. Halfway through, she closed her eyes and fainted. Lu Chen reached out and hugged her. His brows were tightly knitted as he mumbled, What the hell? Why am I so unlucky? The black dog ran madly through the forest in a panic. Before he knew it, he had run far away. When he came back to his senses, he found that he was already on top of another mountain. This place was probably no longer within the boundaries of Stonepan Valley. This mountain was also a bit different from the others. There were basically no tall trees on the mountain. Instead, most of the places were covered with verdant grass. In particular, the gentle slope at the foot of the mountain was covered with a large meadow. The mountain breeze blew and the grass rose and fell like waves. It was like a soft green carpet of grass. Anyone who saw it couldn't help but want to roll around on it. Atsu stood blankly at the foot of the mountain for a while. Then it suddenly looked back and let out 2 soft barks. It seemed to be a bit hesitant, but in the end it still turned around and walked back the way it came. Although the direction it went in seemed to be very dangerous, for it, there seemed to be something more important. It quietly overcame the fear in its heart and made it go back. But at this time, Atsu suddenly heard a mooing sound coming from the distance. To be exact, it came from the depths of the large meadow. It sounded a bit familiar. Atsu was stunned for a moment. It turned around and saw a huge figure lazily turning over in the thick grass. It raised a huge bull's head and glanced at Atsu. It was a huge oxen with 2 strange horns. It's a small world, and we meet again after parting in the desolate valley. Atsu's eyeballs rolled around. Then, it barked at the oxen in the distance and ran over. Atsu ran to the meadow. When it got closer, it could feel the huge size of this oxen. It looked like a small mountain. At that moment, the green ox seemed to be basking in the sun. He had nothing to do and watched curiously as the black puppy ran all the way to him and started barking at him. Woof woof woof, woof 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 woof, Atsu's tail kept wagging. It seemed to be very respectful and deliberately trying to please this green bull. Then it seemed to be pleading. However, oxen had no reaction to this. After looking at Atsu for a moment, it lost interest and let out a mooing sound. Then it closed its eyes again and seemed to be going back to sleep. Atsu became a little anxious, but it didn't dare to be disrespectful to this huge mythological beast. It anxiously paced around on the spot. Right at this moment, a figure suddenly appeared from behind oxen. It was the figure of a woman. She was tall and slender, and she was extremely beautiful. There was a beautiful scarlet feather shawl draped over her shoulders, and it was as if a beautiful fiery cloud had landed on her delicate shoulders. This woman was standing very close to Oxen, and one of her hands was even pressed against Oxen's body. However, Oxen didn't seem to be repulsed by this. It seemed to be treating this woman with special respect. After the woman walked out, there was no expression on her face. Little Ching doesn't like to meddle in other people's business. Don't bother it. Atsu stood rooted to the spot for a long time. It looked at the lazy oxen, then looked at the strange woman, as if it couldn't figure out the relationship between the two. However, it quickly remembered something more important. There was no help here, but there was someone more important to it in the forest at the foot of the mountain. Atsu let out a roar, and it seemed to be a little angry. It barked at the man and the cow before turning around and rushing down the mountain. Oxen didn't move in the slightest. Its eyes were closed, and it seemed that it was about to fall asleep. In contrast, the young woman standing beside Oxen suddenly furrowed her brows. She looked at the little black dog that was running for its life, and said, "There seems to be something wrong with this dog." Moo. Oxen's huge head turned around, and it rubbed the grass on the ground a few times. It yawned, and it still seemed to be disinterested. The young woman kept looking at the back of Atsu in the distance. After thinking for a moment, she said in a low voice, "There's a smell of blood." The grayish-white wall appeared in front of her, and it trembled. When she had just woken up, this was the feeling in front of her. After a while, the young woman regained consciousness. She turned her head with some difficulty, and then she saw the face of Lu Chen sitting by the bed. "You're awake." Lu Chen smiled at her, and nodded with a very gentle expression. The young woman was startled, and she let out a low groan, as if she was startled. She suddenly sat up, and wanted to hit him with a backhand. However, her body had only flipped for a moment, and she suddenly fell back down, falling onto the bed. Fortunately, her body was covered with soft bedding, and it didn't hurt much. The young woman gasped for breath, and then found that her hands and feet were tied, and she couldn't move. However, the bleeding wound on her lower abdomen had been bandaged, and there was a faint pain, and there was a burst of cool feeling on the wound. It seemed that some kind of medicine had been applied, and it felt pretty good. The young woman looked up at Lu Chen, and after staring at him for a moment she said, "What do you mean?" Lu Chen sighed and looked a little helpless, and said, "I've been thinking about how to deal with you." The young woman sneered and said, "What do you want?" Lu Chen stretched out 2 fingers and said, "There are 2 ways. First, I'll treat your injury, and when your injury is healed, we'll pretend that this never happened. Second, I'll just kill you." When the young woman heard the first way, her face was full of contempt, and her face was full of disdain, but when she heard the second way, she was shocked and said angrily, "How dare you? You dare to kill me?" Lu Chen said seriously, "I have no other way." The young woman became even angrier and said angrily, "What do you mean by no other way? Why do you have to kill me? I didn't provoke you. Don't tell me it's because I wanted to steal a few seed of asparagus from you in that broken shop a few days ago? I say, you look quite good, but how can you be so vicious?" Lu Chen said, "What you scolded me with just now, except for one thing, is wrong. I'm not that kind of person." The young woman stared at him, and after a moment she sneered, "You just said that you want to kill me. But tell me, what did I say just now?" Lu Chen coughed, and said, "That shop is indeed a broken shop. There's no other way, the shop owner is stupid. As for the rest, I won't admit it." The young woman snorted, looking like she obviously didn't believe him, but after these words, the atmosphere between the two eased up a bit. After a while, the young woman thought for a moment and said, "I've already told you my identity. If you're not afraid of angering true monarch, then go ahead and harm me." Lu Chen said, "I don't want to harm you." The young woman raised her hand, looked at the rope, and sneered, "Then why are you tying me up?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment, and stared at her eyes and said, "I don't want to provoke Hakushin Jinkuen, so I can let you go. But you have to tell me, at such a young age, where did you learn these killing skills?" Chapter 104. I don't have the ability to kill people. The little girl flatly denied and sneered. "Go out and ask around." I'm a girl who grew up in Kunwa cities by clan. I'm pure, upright, dignified, gentle, and lovable. It would be strange if anyone would believe your words. Lu Chen was silent for a moment, then said, You're more powerful than I thought. After a pause he said, By clan's member? White Lotus. The girl glanced at him and asked, What about you? Lu Chen. White Lotus, who was born with a devastatingly beautiful face at such a young age, sized up Lu Chen with her bright eyes, then looked around the room and said, You're still a part-time disciple? Lu Chen smiled and said, My aptitude isn't good. I've made a fool of myself. Humph. White Lotus seemed to be a bit young after all. After hearing this compliment, a complacent expression appeared on her face. But very soon, her face suddenly darkened, and she spat and said, Pa, you can still catch me with your aptitude? You're beating around the bush to scold me. Lu Chen smiled and shook his head, not saying anything. White Lotus rolled her eyes and suddenly looked at him with interest. She said, Speaking of which, how can a part-time disciple have such messy abilities? What's your background? Lu Chen said, I used to kill pigs. I've seen blood and fought before. Later, I felt that killing pigs was boring, so I wanted to become an immortal and gain the Tao. That's why I went through untold hardships to come to the Kunlun party. Butcher. The smile on White Lotus's face suddenly froze. As Lu Chen spoke, although he looked relaxed on the surface, his mind was spinning rapidly. This girl, White Lotus, was obviously a huge trouble. If he didn't handle it carefully, it could bring about endless troubles in the future. Thinking of this, even he who was always calm, couldn't help but complain in his heart. He thought to himself, Nowadays even a 10-year-old girl is so scary. What will happen when she grows up? At this moment, the two of them suddenly heard a rustling sound coming from the door. White Lotus's eyes lit up, but Lu Chen stood up calmly and walked to the door to open it. A black shadow darted in with a swoosh. It was Black Dog. As soon as it came in, it intimately rubbed against Lu Chen's side and wagged its tail with all its might, looking like it was flattering Lu Chen. Lu Chen closed the door and scolded with a smile. Don't pretend to be stupid. I still remember how you abandoned me and ran away by yourself. Atsu suddenly let out a low whimper, looking a little sad. But at this moment, a sneer suddenly came from the other side of the bed. It was White Lotus who was lying there and sneered. Who's pretending? I clearly remember that you told this black dog to run away first, and now you're blaming the dog? Can't you have a conscience when you speak, uncle? Uncle. Lu Chen's face darkened, but before he could retort, Atu had already turned around to look at the young girl lying on the bed. He immediately let out an angry roar as the hair on his neck stood on end. He bared his teeth and roared fiercely at Bai Lian. It looked like he was about to rush up and bite her if he didn't agree with him. Uncle. Lu Chen's expression darkened. White Lotus, however, was not afraid at all. She looked at Atsu and sneered. Stupid dog, if you bark at me again I'll skin you. Atsu was getting more and more annoyed, but it seemed that it was really a little afraid of White Lotus. It barked repeatedly, but it stayed at the feet of Lu Chen, and did not rush forward even half a step. Lu Chen kicked Atsu's butt and scolded. Idiot, she's tied up by me. What are you afraid of? Atsu stared at White Lotus. Sure enough, it saw that White Lotus was lying on the bed with her hands and feet tied up. It suddenly became excited and rushed over with a loud bark. It rushed in front of White Lotus like a wolf or a tiger, opened its big mouth and bit randomly in the air, threatening her. White Lotus was so angry that her little face turned pale. She blocked a few times with her hands and then said angrily, Stupid dog, you're really as heartless as your master. Did you forget that I gave you your favorite thing? Atu whimpered a couple of times. It looked like it couldn't understand human language anymore, but it still managed to sneak a peek at Lu Chen from the corner of its eyes as it bared its fangs. Lu Chen walked over and said with a slight frown, By the way, this is also something I want to ask you. How do you know about blood food? White Lotus' face suddenly changed, but then she snorted and turned her head away. She had a look of, I don't understand what you're talking about, and I'm too lazy to say more. Lu Chen's face darkened and said indifferently, Blood food is a secret method passed down from generation to generation in the southern barbarians. Only the great shamans and priests can practice this method, and it has never been passed down in the Central Plains. Do you know that once I report this matter, you may be directly burned to death in front of this Kunlun mountain, not to mention becoming a disciple of a true monarch. White Lotus' face changed several times in a row. She turned her head to look at Lu Chen, and her eyes became cold. She said, "You're just a butcher. How do you know so much? How many secrets do you have in secret? I don't think I need to tell you. A janitor disciple with ruthless means, astonishing strength, and knowing so many secrets. If I were to say, you might even be a spy of the evil sect. If we really shed all pretense of cordiality, do you believe that you won't be able to live?" Lu Chen lowered his head slightly. After a moment he shook his head and said slowly, "I'm not a spy of the evil sect." "Who would believe that?" White Lotus sneered and said. She stared at Lu Chen, her eyes as cold as a snake. There was a short silence in the room. For a moment no one spoke. But both sides were still staring at each other. No one was willing to step back. The atmosphere became somewhat tense. Atsu was still fiercely baring its fangs at the side. But after baring its fangs for a long time, and almost dripped its saliva onto the bed, Atsu suddenly realized that the other two people didn't seem to have the intention to look at it. The two of them stared at each other, threatening each other with their fiercest eyes. From Atsu's point of view, it seemed that these two humans were angrily competing whose eyes could stare wider, and whose eyes could last longer without blinking. Atsu suddenly felt a little embarrassed. It awkwardly closed its mouth and swallowed its saliva. Then, looking at the two people who were staring at each other, it decided to help its master. Woof 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 woof. The black dog suddenly roared. Then, it jumped up and opened its big mouth to bite down on White Lotus's face. Lu Chen and White Lotus, who were confronting each other and trying to overwhelm each other's imposing manner, were startled at the same time. White Lotus cried out in alarm and subconsciously leaned to the side. But Atsu was very close to her, so how could she dodge in such a hurry? In a moment of desperation, White Lotus's complexion suddenly darkened. Her bound wrists suddenly leaned against her chest as if she had grabbed something. On the side, Lu Chen's heart stirred. He hastily shouted, "Atsu, don't act recklessly. For a proud daughter of heaven like White Lotus, no matter how she behaved in private, she was, after all, the daughter of an influential family in Kunwa City. Moreover, she was destined to become Hakushin Jinkuin's disciple. It would be strange if a person with such an identity didn't have any life-saving trump cards." But in that split second, Atsu's body paused for a moment. All of a sudden, an emerald green light shone out from White Lotus's chest and fell on Atsu's body. Atsu's body suddenly stopped in midair. It didn't go up nor go down, just hovering in the air a few feet above the ground. The inexplicable black dog was somewhat puzzled and afraid. Its ferocious appearance disappeared, and it looked around for a moment before barking at Lu Chen. Lu Chen's complexion changed when the green light shot out, but then he felt that the power within it wasn't fierce and it didn't have any killing intent. So his expression relaxed a little. At this moment, he shook his head and no longer cared about Atsu. Instead, he turned to White Lotus and said, "I don't care what you think. In short, from the beginning, I didn't take the initiative to cause trouble for you. Since both of us have some unspeakable secrets, I think we might as well shake hands and make up. What do you think?" White Lotus's pair of bright eyes stared at Lu Chen, as if trying to see through the heart of the man in front of her. After a moment, she suddenly sneered and said, "Don't just say nice things, let me go first." Lu Chen nodded and said, "Of course, but with your life-saving skills, this bit of rope shouldn't be able to trap you." White Lotus smiled and said, "Uncle, I can't tell, you're almost a demon." As she said that, the green light in front of her suddenly flashed, and Atsu was bounced out and fell on the ground beside the bed. Then the green light slightly sank, flashed past her hands and feet, and the ropes immediately broke. White Lotus rubbed her wrist and sat up, then looked at Lu Chen with a smile that was not a smile and said, "Then let's have a good chat now?" Lu Chen looked at the green light that was still flashing incessantly in front of her chest, nodded and said, "Sure, but you put this thing away first." White Lotus snorted and said, "I'll put it away, who knows if you will suddenly get greedy and try to harm me again." Lu Chen said. If I want to harm you, just now when you weren't awake, I have already done it countless times. White Lotus's cheeks turned slightly red, glared at him and said, already so old, fighting with a little girl like me and still using underhanded methods to plot against me. Don't you have any shame? Lu Chen closed his eyes, shook his head and pretended not to hear. After a sigh he said, quickly put it away. White Lotus took a deep breath, turned her wrist. The green light flashed and slowly retracted back into her palm. Lu Chen looked at the green light with some curiosity and said, I have never heard of such a treasure before. It seems to be incomparably rich in wood spiritual qi. Is it some kind of wood heavenly treasure? White Lotus didn't pay attention to him, probably because she didn't want to reveal the secret. The green light in her palm flickered, wavering nonstop. Lu Chen waited for a while, but saw that the green light didn't seem to retract much. He couldn't help but said, Hey, do you still want to talk or not? Why did you take so long to retract this thing? Before he finished speaking, he suddenly heard White Lotus cry out in alarm. Her face instantly turned pale, and she said involuntarily, No, why can't I control it? Lu Chen's heart jumped. He suddenly looked up, only to see that the green light suddenly burst out in White Lotus's palm. The light was so bright that he could even faintly hear a terrifying whistling sound, like a violent wind passing by. After a moment, a green light suddenly rushed out, like a sharp sword. It directly pierced into Lu Chen's heart. Chapter 105. Lu Chen's first reaction was that this little girl, White Lotus, was really vicious and ruthless, not forgetting to silence people at all times. This kind of ferocious temperament, it was really the first time he had seen in his life. Most likely even the evil faction people could not compare to her. But in that split second, he saw that White Lotus's face was indeed filled with fear, and her entire body was suddenly wrapped by the bright green light, and then inexplicably floated up, letting out a scream. The green light that tore through the air was like an unstoppable tidal wave. Its speed was as fast as lightning, and it instantly filled the small house. Lu Chen had almost no time to react. With a loud bang, the emerald green light beam that seemed to be solid heavily hit his chest. Lu Chen's entire body shook, a muffled sound, his entire body flew out, hit the wall behind him. A trace of blood flowed down from the corner of his mouth. But very quickly he seemed to feel something. His expression changed greatly, looked down at his chest. That emerald green light beam shone straight on his chest, in the depths of the light, to be exact, in his chest cavity, in his heart where blood was boiling. A gentle white light, in that intense green light, quietly emitted out. Like in a vast sea of raging waves, there was a pure white flower towering majestically. But in the next moment, all the green light suddenly became 30% more intense, as if it had been stimulated by something. It expanded crazily and surged toward Lu Chen's chest from all directions. Wherever the light passed, the tables, chairs, and beds all floated up, and then were twisted and broken by a violent force. The room was in a mess, and even the surrounding walls were trembling slightly. It looked like the room was about to collapse. Lu Chen felt as if all the blood and flesh in his body were boiling. His face contorted as he howled in pain. He suddenly raised his head and roared at the White Lotus in front of him. Quickly suppress this light, or we'll all die. But after he shouted, he found that the girl in front of him, White Lotus, was still floating in midair, but her black hair was fluttering, and her eyes were closed. He did not know when she had fainted. Not far from her, the black dog was also swept up by the strange green light. It spun around in the air, and barked a few times in panic. Suddenly, its head tilted to one side, and it seemed to have lost consciousness. The surging power was like a tide, crazily surging towards Lu Chen. In that instant, Lu Chen felt as if his entire body was about to fall apart. At this critical moment, he forcefully endured the intense pain, suddenly gritted his teeth and with a low growl, he desperately used his hand to press against his chest. The gentle light in the depths of the green light seemed to be flickering in his palm, wind, and fingertips. In the next moment, all the power suddenly came to a halt. It was as if the world had gone silent, and time had frozen. The green light was like solidified green ice, flashing a strange light in the air. The man and the dog, who were floating in the air, were frozen for a moment. Then after that moment, Everything disappeared with a loud bang. The light dissipated with a roar. The figure disappeared into thin air. Everything returned to nothingness. In the small hut, like a whirlwind sweeping away the clouds, everything disappeared. Green light, Lu-chan, White Lotus and even Atsu, in the blink of an eye, all disappeared. Only the garbage fragments that were originally blown into the air suddenly lost their support. And then like rain, they fell to the ground a mess. After an unknown period of time, Lu-chan suddenly felt a warm and moist feeling on his face. He shook his head, feeling that his eyes and ears had not calmed down. It was still a mess. He closed his eyes and rested for a while. That strange feeling slowly receded, and then he opened his eyes. A tongue licked him next to him. A low whining sound came. It was Atsu's voice. Lu-chan took a deep breath, smiled at Atsu, and then sat up. When his body was only halfway up, he sucked in a breath of cold air, and almost fell down again. He quickly used his hands to support himself on the ground, and only then did he stabilize his body. At this moment, he only felt a strong pain coming from many parts of his body, especially his chest, which was the most uncomfortable. He touched the position of his chest with his hand, but found that there was actually no wound there. It seemed that the feeling just now was just an illusion. Lu-chan calmed himself down, then turned his head to look around. At this moment, he was in the mysterious tree hole-like space that he entered a long time ago. The ancient and mottled tree wall stood silently with the misty green air. And in the center of this tree hole, the puddle was still there. The water was clear and transparent, but it was no longer full of vitality. If one took a closer look, they would notice that there was a tiny and dark shadow hiding in the clear water somewhere in the depths of the water. It was like a dark flame, quietly burning. On the other side of the puddle, there was another petite figure lying on the ground 3 feet away. It was White Lotus. But at this moment, she was lying there with her eyes closed, her face slightly pale, and she was motionless for a long time, as if she was still in a coma. Lu-chan frowned, withdrew his gaze, and glanced at Atsu beside him, only to find that both he and White Lotus did not seem to be in a good condition. Only Atsu did not know why. After the torment just now, at this moment, it seemed like nothing had happened, walking back and forth freely beside him, and at the same time, looking curiously at the small world in the tree hole that he had never seen before. It seems that you are the first to wake up. Lu-chan touched Atsu's head. Atsu grinned, and seemed to be in a good mood. Lu-chan smiled, then slowly stood up, and carefully examined his body. Except for some pain all over his body, there did not seem to be any particularly serious injuries. Only then did he feel relieved. But at the same time, looking at the surrounding tree hole, he also frowned. This tree hole, especially the mysterious puddle in the tree hole, was the key to him being able to survive the incomparably vicious, black flame curse. It was the strange surging vitality in the water that suppressed the terrible black flame again and again, including 10 years later when he made his last attempt against the black flame curse, once again maintaining his vitality. In the past 10 years, only he had entered this place, and only he knew about it. Even Old Ma knew nothing about it. This was because this mysterious tree hole was actually the mysterious and unfathomable seed he had obtained from the blazing heavenly light during the Battle of the Desolate Valley back then. This seed was undoubtedly extremely important. Not to mention anything else, just by looking at the God-vanquishing curse formation that the devil cult cast back then. It used this strange seed as the core weight, and thus caused a phenomenon of heaven and earth, attracting and controlling unimaginable power of heaven and earth. One could tell how powerful it was. At the end of the Battle of the Desolate Valley, Lang had obtained it. Then, under some strange circumstances, the seed had actually silently hidden itself in his body. To be precise, it had somehow penetrated deep into his heart. It was also from then on that the seed seemed to have merged with Lu-chan, and Lu-chan soon discovered that there was another strange space in this seemingly small seed, and he could actually enter and exit this mysterious tree hole in that feeling of flesh and blood connection. At the same time, he found the life-saving spiritual water of life in the tree hole. Over the past 10 years, it was all thanks to this seed and the mysterious tree hole that Lu-chan was able to barely survive, even though he had still endured unimaginable pain along the way. However, when he fought against the Black Flame Curse in King Shitang village, He was lucky to survive, but he had already used up all the spiritual water of life. From then on, he rarely entered this mysterious tree hole. This was because in the past 10 years he had of course explored this tree hole countless times. Every inch of the ground, every inch of the tree bark, including the hazy green gas, he had carefully explored it all. However, the disappointing thing was that apart from the amazing spiritual water of life in the puddle, he had not found anything else in this tree hole. It seemed like this was just a space that contained the spiritual water of life. Even so, it was actually quite amazing. Lu Chen was not a greedy person, so after his fruitless exploration, he did not continue. Until today, when the green light suddenly brought him, White Lotus, and Atsu into this place. Green light. Lu Chen suddenly raised his eyebrows and suddenly turned around, his eyes bright as he looked at White Lotus, who was still unconscious on the ground. Walking around the puddle, Lu Chen slowly walked to White Lotus's side, and then squatted down. His gaze lingered on White Lotus's young but beautiful face for a moment. She was still unconscious and looked like she was asleep. At this moment, she was so quiet that she was like an ordinary girl. The inexplicable fragrance of innocence was like a flower that had just bloomed, and there was a breathtaking beauty about her. Some of her black hair slid down from her temples and rested on her gentle and fair cheeks. The little girl seemed to be dreaming of something. There was no longer any pain, anger, or viciousness on her face. The corners of her mouth were slightly pursed, as if she was smiling. That smile was so sweet. Could it be that she was dreaming of the person she loved the most? Lu Chen had never seen a person's temperament change so much when they were asleep. However, he quickly thought of something else. When White Lotus was awake in front of others, she seemed to have the temperament of a cold fairy. This little 10-year-old girl, how could she have so many different faces? Which one was the real one? Lu Chen silently stared at her beautiful face for a moment. Then his gaze moved down to White Lotus's chest. Under the corner of her clothes, there was a soft but green radiance quietly flashing. Chapter 106. The faint light under the lapel was extremely green. It looked as if it was real, like the greenest and most crystalline jade. It was obviously of the same origin as the green light that had suddenly erupted before, but the difference in power was like heaven and earth. Lu Chen pondered for a moment and lifted the corner of the lapel. Sure enough, on the girl's snow-white neck, there was a pendant hanging on a thin string. It was shaped like a bamboo branch, and it was as thick as a thumb. It was green all over, and it was full of spiritual energy in the light. It was hard to imagine that the violent scene that had suddenly appeared was caused by this warm, jade-green object. But all of this was not important. The most important thing was that Lu Chen clearly remembered that this green twig pendant actually resonated with the seed in his body before, and it was precisely because of this that all kinds of strange phenomena occurred. In the end, it directly rushed into this mysterious tree hole with 2 people and a dog. This green twig must have a great relationship with this seed. Lu Chen stared at this beautiful jade-like twig, and his eyes became brighter and brighter. Atsu wandered around Lu Chen, curiously looking at the unconscious White Lotus lying on the ground. From time to time, it turned its head to look at Lu Chen. However, after seeing that Lu Chen did not move, Atsu felt a little bored. It turned its head to look around, and looked at the surrounding tree walls with interest. It observed the places where the roots of the gullies were, wondering if it should run over there, and pee later to show that this place also belonged to it, Atsu. At this moment, Atsu suddenly heard Lu Chen's voice. It sounded a little low and somewhat inexplicable, as if there was a trace of a sigh. He said, "A twig, 2 leaves, and a seed. I didn't expect it to be true." Atsu poked his head over and glanced at Lu Chen. Lu Chen smiled and stroked its head, but his eyes were still staring at that emerald green branch. He said, "I originally thought that the people in the evil faction were all crazy, and I also thought that what they said was all crazy talk. That legendary divine tree that can connect the 3 worlds was even more so their crazy ravings." He smiled, perhaps with a hint of mockery, lightly said, "1 branch, 2 leaves, 1 seed. This is the only thing left in our world when the tree of God was destroyed in the ancient times in the myths of the evil cult. The story also clearly states that as long as these 4 divine items are gathered, The divine tree will be reborn and the three realms will be unified. The one that resonated with the seed should be the only branch of the divine tree in this world. Atsu waited for a while, seeing that Lu Chen was still deep in thought. It walked away alone, and came to the strange wooden walls at the edge of the tree hole. It started to sniff and search for something. But it had only walked a few steps when it suddenly heard Lu Chen's voice behind it. Atsu, don't pee. There's no ventilation here, it will stink to death. Atsu turned around and barked at Lu Chen. He looked a little dissatisfied, but he still walked back. He looked back at the wall of trees as if he was reluctant to part with them. As if he was regretful. Lu Chen did not pay attention to that somewhat resentful stupid dog. His eyes were still focused on that emerald green branch in front of him. After a moment, he stretched out his fingers and grabbed the branch, then slowly clenched it. In the tree hole, there seemed to be a moment of silence. Suddenly, a light lit up. A green light shone out from the gap between his fingers, followed by another, one after another. From every gap in his palm tenaciously emitted dark green light. That light was slightly trembling. A moment later, an abnormally strong aroma abruptly spread out. From Lu Chen's palm, from his clenched fist, from every crack, an incomparably viscous green liquid suddenly flowed out. Lu Chen stared at this green water, watching it slowly flowing along his palm, then dripping down and floating in the air. The tree hole that had been silent for countless years at this moment suddenly seemed to let out a deep sigh, like a traveler who had been starving for a long time, trembling slightly because of joy. Those misty green gas began to quickly flow up the tree wall, flashing, letting the dark green liquid float in the air, and then at a speed visible to the naked eye, little by little turned into incomparably fine powder, floating to every corner of the tree hole. With the wind dancing, the green turned into waves, spinning on their own, like a heavy rain that had been waiting for thousands of years, like a date that had been late for thousands of years, finally meeting. Lu Chen and Atsu stood on the ground in a daze, watching this magnificent and incomparably strange scene. Green drowned everything. It was like a flood in ancient times. All the fine powder rushed towards the tree wall. In the blink of an eye it covered every place, turning this ancient tree hole into a green world. But very quickly, the green powder seemed to fuse with the tree wall, quickly disappearing. Boom! From the silence, suddenly a roar sounded, as if it came from the deepest part of this ancient tree hole. Lu Chen suddenly looked up, only to see the tree wall around the tree hole becoming blurry in an instant. The green light frantically flickered, and then, suddenly the world became pitch black. The surroundings were empty. He seemed to suddenly be in a dark and boundless void. Above and below, left and right, there was only boundless darkness. There was no sky and no earth. Even his body seemed to have lost all its strength, floating emptily in the darkness. Specks of light suddenly lit up from afar. There were also sounds of woof 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 woof. It seemed to be Atsu's voice, with a hint of panic and doubt. Lu Chen looked up, only to see a head full of stars. Looking down, it was still the same. His body seemed to be constantly floating, completely out of control, drifting aimlessly in this magical void, until suddenly the emerald green light lit up again. The light abruptly pierced through the darkness and blossomed into an indescribable brilliance in the void. Then, from the depths of the emerald light cluster, countless rays of light that looked like strange roots suddenly extended out, shattering the seemingly solid darkness. Like tree roots, they extended into this dark world. Then the light shone brightly, like a violent sun suddenly appeared in front of him, radiating thousands of rays of light. At that moment, it was as if all the stars in the sky had lost their luster. The light dimmed slightly, there was a wind blowing. The whistling sound between heaven and earth faintly came, like a desolate ancient song from ancient times, faintly narrating the past. A door formed by the emerald green light suddenly appeared in front of him. After a moment, the green light suddenly soared, passed through his body and gathered again. Lu Chen looked back, only to see that behind him, a similar emerald green door had formed. The green light was bright, as if there was a surging life aura, dispersing all the darkness. The light flickered, everything seemed to have turned into a dark green ocean, but after a moment, suddenly everything in front of him disappeared, like a dream shattered in front of him, turning into endless dust. Luchan found himself once again in the tree hole, still standing in the same place. Those bright and dazzling green light, at this moment had completely dissipated. There was no longer any trace of it. The ancient tree hole seemed to have once again returned to its original state. But if one looked closely, one could still see that on the ancient mottled tree wall, there was suddenly a lot more vitality, and even the strange green gas that entangled inside and outside the tree wall. At this moment the color had deepened a lot. But what surprised Luchan the most was that on the two sides of the tree wall, behind the hazy gas, there suddenly appeared the outline of two doors. They were not really two doors, but only the vague outline of two doors. At the same time, most of them were covered by the ancient tree wall and the moving gas. Luchan tried to touch it, but found that it was like the moon in the water. He could only vaguely see it. When he really wanted to touch it, he could not feel it no matter what. These two doors, were they real doors? If they were doors, then where did they lead to? Luchan silently pondered for a moment, then looked back, only to see that White Lotus was still lying unconscious on the ground. For some reason, it seemed that when the green light resonated with the seed, a powerful force burst out. It had a particularly great impact on her, so until now, she still could not wake up. Luchan walked back to her side after checking. His brows quickly wrinkled, because he found that the girl's breathing was suddenly becoming slower, and the interval between breaths was getting longer and longer, like some kind of monster hibernating in the mud cave in the cold winter. But people can't hibernate. Luchan touched her hand. It was cold to the touch. Without any hesitation, Luchan immediately sat down, then called Atsu, who was standing on the side, and let it lie beside him. At the same time, he held White Lotus in his arms, and his other hand grabbed Atsu. Before he moved, his eyes glanced at White Lotus's chest, and suddenly he was startled. He saw that the pendant she was wearing was still as green as usual, but for some reason, the original vitality had weakened by more than half. He looked at the emerald green branch, then closed his eyes, suddenly let out a low shout. His hands suddenly hugged White Lotus and Atsu tightly. There seemed to be a loud bang in their ears. At that moment, they seemed to have passed through countless miles. It seemed like a long time, but it also seemed like the blink of an eye. Suddenly, the two of them appeared out of thin air in that messy hut. Bang! They fell from midair. Atsu quivered, jumped up as if it had been electrocuted, shook its head and wagged its tail, looking very excited, very happy that it finally returned to this familiar world. And Luchan turned his head to look at White Lotus, after seeing her breath stop for a moment, then began to return to normal. He finally breathed a sigh of relief. She didn't seem to be very used to that tree hole. Luchan muttered in his heart. Then his eyes once again fell on the emerald green pendant on White Lotus's chest. His brows wrinkled again, feeling a little troublesome in his heart. At this moment, White Lotus's body moved. It looked like she was about to wake up. Luchan's eyebrows twitched. His mind turned quickly. Countless thoughts surged in his mind in an instant. Suddenly, he stretched out his hand and tore off the clothes covering his chest. Then the black sword suddenly appeared in his hand. With a flip of his hand, he directly stabbed the flesh on his chest a few times. Immediately, blood flowed out, and for a moment, his flesh was badly mutilated. Luchan groaned in pain, but the next moment he turned his palm over. The black sword immediately disappeared. His body swayed a little. His face suddenly became pale, as if half of the blood in his body had flowed out from the wound. He suddenly fell to the ground, slamming heavily. After a moment, this sound seemed to startle White Lotus. She was a little dazed, opened her eyes, then her body immediately shook. Seeing not far from her, Luchan fell to the ground, body twitching uncontrollably. Suddenly she was shocked, couldn't help but sit up, and asked in shock, What's wrong with you?" Luchan covered his wound, his face twisted in pain, looking at the unusually beautiful girl in front of him. Even his voice became hoarse. "I didn't expect you to be such a woman, wanting to kill me just because of a disagreement." "Ah?" Chapter 107. White Lotus stood rooted to the ground, her mouth half open. She looked a little sluggish, as if she hadn't come back to her senses for a while. After a while she said in astonishment, I did it. If it wasn't you, who else could it be?" Lu Chen fell to the ground, took 2 deep breaths and then sneered. Isn't this your precious artifact? White Lotus subconsciously touched the pendant on her chest, only to feel that it was as warm as usual, and there was no change in the light. After thinking for a moment, she said with some uncertainty, "Just now. I really didn't mean to kill you, although I feel that you are not a good person." Lu Chen said, "You're cruel by nature. You don't even think before you kill, do you?" White Lotus was startled, her face revealing a suspicious expression, but it seemed that she really had a little doubt about herself. She stammered, Don't shouldn't be." "What shouldn't be?" Lu Chen interrupted White Lotus's recollection, saying, "I just shouted for you to quickly stop, or else we will all die. Do you remember?" White Lotus pondered for a moment. Finally a little embarrassment flashed across her face, and said, I think I heard this sentence." "Humph." Lu Chen covered his chest with his hand, sucking in a cold breath. In addition, blood flowed and dyed the lapel of his clothes red. It looked like he was half dead. Speaking of which, it was strange. Not long ago, the two of them were still fighting and killing each other, but at this moment, White Lotus was somewhat embarrassed. She sat on the bed for a moment, then stood up, took 2 steps towards Lu Chen, and then stopped, saying, Uncle, are you okay? I saw your sinister and ruthless appearance just now. You shouldn't die so easily, right?" Lu Chen rolled his eyes and heaved a sigh of relief in his heart. But then he spat and said, "Do you want me to stab you in the heart twice?" White Lotus frowned. Just as she was about to say something else, there was a sudden knock on the door from the other side of the door. Puff, 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 puff. "Brother Lu, are you home? I went to the spiritual field, but I didn't see you and Atsu." A clear and melodious voice came from outside. It was the Exion's voice. Everyone in the room was stunned at the same time. Then Lu Chen and White Lotus looked around at the same time, and saw that the room was in a mess. All the tables and chairs, including the bed and bedding, had been smashed into pieces and scattered around the room. It looked like a sudden storm had swept through the place. White Lotus immediately shook her head at Lu Chen, and Lu Chen also nodded without hesitation. However, Atsu reacted faster than them. The black dog leaped up, overjoyed, and barked wildly in the direction of the door. Woof, 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 woof. Lu Chen, White Lotus. The 2 people in the room looked at each other, and the voice outside the door suddenly became louder, full of joy and laughter. Atsu, you're home. Brother Lu is here too, right? Quick, open the door for me." After a pause, Exion smiled and said, "Atsu, I've brought you some delicious bones." The black dog became even more excited. Its tail wagged wildly, and it rushed to the door. It jumped up and down, using its forelimbs to fiddle with the door latch. It looked like it was trying hard to open the door for Exion. White Lotus turned her gaze back to Lu Chen, and Lu Chen looked back at her. After a while, White Lotus suddenly said, "Why is your dog so stupid?" Lu Chen coughed and said, "It was an accident." With a bang, the door latch was pried open by Atsu. Exion pushed the door open with a smile and walked in. Atsu enthusiastically pounced on her, lying on her body and rubbing against her. Exion affectionately patted Atsu's head and smiled. Then she took out a bag and poured out a few bones. She smiled and said, "Atsu, eat." Atsu cheered and ran to the side with the bones in its mouth. Exion stood up and looked forward. At the same time, she smiled and said, "Brother Lu, why are you so early today?" Her voice suddenly stopped, and her smile seemed to freeze on her face. She saw the terrible state of the room, and was momentarily speechless. After a while, she saw Lu Chen sitting on the ground with his hand covering his chest and half of his body bleeding. She suddenly screamed and ran over. She lost her voice and said, Brother Lu, what happened to you?" Lu Chen smiled bitterly and said, "I suffered a little injury." Exion's face suddenly turned pale. Then, she looked around and saw White Lotus standing on the other side of the room. She looked at the broken pieces of the room, and seemed to understand something. She stared at White Lotus and shouted, "You hurt Brother Lu?" White Lotus hesitated and said, "Maybe yes." Exion only felt a sudden surge of anger. She suddenly stood up and shouted at White Lotus, "Brother Lu is such a good person. He stands aloof from worldly affairs. It is impossible for him to provoke you, the eldest daughter of the Bai family. Why did you hurt him? Ah. Lu Chun and White Lotus were shocked at the same time. Lu Chun pulled Exian and said, "How do you know her identity?" Exian said angrily, "That day, I saw her at the mountain gate with you. I was a bit curious, so I went to ask around. Kunwa City is only so big and there are only so many aristocratic families, so I naturally found out." As she spoke, she took a step forward and stood in front of Lu Chun. Although White Lotus looked younger and wasn't as tall as Exian, her imposing manner seemed to overwhelm Exian, causing Exian to be cautious. However, she still looked angry and said, "Miss Bai, you already have such a talented background. Moreover, you are favored by the heavens and are about to become a true sovereign's disciple. There is a world of difference between the two of you. Why did you come to bully an ordinary odd-job disciple like Brother Lu?" She didn't know why, but when she saw Exian's angry but beautiful face, White Lotus felt speechless. In the end, she could only shake her head. Even her voice became a bit lower and she said, You misunderstood." "What did I misunderstand?" Exian looked angry and didn't believe what she said. "Forget it, Exian." At this time, Lu Chun pulled on Exian's sleeve from behind. After she turned around, he said, "Just now I was careless. I fell and hurt myself. Don't blame Miss Bai." "You fell yourself, and you even injured your chest so badly?" Exian looked like she had seen a ghost. Lu Chun laughed dryly, then looked at White Lotus and said, "Miss Bai, we can be considered. No discord, no concord. Why don't we just let it go?" White Lotus stared at him, and after a moment, she slowly nodded and said, "You're right. There's nothing between us. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. But what happened before?" The corner of Lu Chen's mouth revealed a trace of a smile. He cut her off and said, "Let's mind our own business in the future. What do you think?" "Okay." White Lotus pondered for a moment, then nodded and agreed. Then she walked towards the door. Exian looked at White Lotus unhappily. It seemed that she was still holding a grudge. But when she walked to the door, White Lotus suddenly turned around and looked at Exian. "May I ask which family are you from?" As she spoke, Bai Lian's expression had completely returned to normal. She had returned to the elegant, cold, and otherworldly beauty of a young girl, like a banished immortal. The speed and smoothness of the change made Lu Chun secretly speechless. Exian hesitated for a moment, but then she thought that with the ability and background of the person in front of her, it wouldn't be difficult for him to find out her background. So she directly replied, "My surname is E." White Lotus was clearly startled. After thinking carefully for a moment, she seemed to recall something. She said, "Oh, the E family in the east of the city, right?" Exian said, "Yes, what do you want?" White Lotus smiled. "You're thinking too much. We are all descendants of aristocratic families and disciples of the same sect. There will be many opportunities for us to take care of each other in the future. There's no need for us to be enemies." She was extremely beautiful to begin with, so when she spoke in such a natural and unrestrained manner, it was hard for anyone to dislike her. Exian also couldn't keep a straight face. She pursed her lips and waited for a moment before replying, "Oh." However, White Lotus's gaze then shifted to Lu Chun, who was behind Exian. Suddenly, she said seriously, "Sister E, I have something to say to you." Exian was taken aback. She wasn't used to White Lotus suddenly calling her sister. After all, although she was innocent, she still understood some basic principles. White Lotus's identity, status, and background were too different from hers. Even if White Lotus was young, Exian really didn't expect her to call her sister. She was stunned for a moment before saying, "What?" White Lotus said, "I think Sister E should be a good person with a kind heart. But this uncle. Hey, can't you stop calling him uncle?" White Lotus ignored the other person's complaints and said to Exian with a gentle expression, "I think you should be careful of this man. He looks harmless and gentle, but in fact he is vicious and cruel. I have never seen such a person in my life. If you get too close to him, you will hurt yourself sooner or later." She looked sincerely at Exian, her eyes clear and pure. like the most beautiful and flawless flower in the world. She said gently, "The two of you are not the same kind of people. Don't be with him." The room suddenly became silent. No one spoke for a while. The atmosphere seemed to be slightly awkward, but after a moment, Exian suddenly frowned. The scar on her cheek was still there. It was a faint scar, but it didn't seem to damage her beauty. Instead, it only added a bit of heroic spirit to her. She looked at White Lotus, looked at the girl who was destined to become an influential figure in the world in the future, the girl who was destined to become the proud daughter of the Kunlun party. Finally, Exian snorted and said loudly, "I don't believe it." Chapter 108. This I don't believe. Exian said it resolutely, and there seemed to be no room for doubt. Even Luchan looked at Exian with some surprise, and his face showed some surprise. And White Lotus was obviously even more surprised, and even looked at Exian with some disbelief, and said, "You believe him so much?" Exian nodded without hesitation and said, "Yes." White Lotus was speechless. She seemed to be smart, but at this moment when facing Exian, she also had a feeling of helplessness. She could only shake her head and sighed and said, "Well, anyway, I have told you, don't regret it in the future." Exian turned her head and no longer looked at her. Obviously, she did not take this warning to heart at all. White Lotus turned her head to look at Luchan, and saw that Luchan was still sitting on the ground, and then he raised his hand slightly and smiled at her. White Lotus snorted, and did not say anything more. She turned and walked straight out of the room, and closed the door. Perhaps only the loud sound of the door closing revealed that she was a little annoyed in her heart. When White Lotus left, Exian hurriedly went to Luchan's side and helped him to stand up. Originally, she wanted to find a place to sit and rest, but when she saw the mess around, and there was not even a decent chair to sit on, she was stunned for a moment, and then asked Luchan, "What happened in your room? Why is everything broken?" Luchan smiled bitterly and said, "It's a long story, I will tell you in detail later." "Oh," Exian responded. At the moment, she had no choice but to let Luchan stand first, and then went to the side to sweep a slightly cleaner place, and then put some unbroken pillows and quilts on it, and let Luchan sit down. Then she looked at Luchan with a look of concern on her face, and whispered, "Brother Lu, are you really okay?" "Well, it's nothing serious. I just need to rest. My chest is just a skin wound, it's not a big deal." Exian breathed a sigh of relief, and a relaxed smile appeared on her face. Then she turned around and shouted, "Atsu, Brother Lu is fine, don't worry." In the corner next to the door, Atsu was happily gnawing on a bone. After hearing Exian's words, it raised its head and glanced at them. It wagged its tail, blinked its eyes, and then continued to gnaw on the bone without saying a word. The smile on Exian's face suddenly froze. After a while, she laughed dryly and turned to Luchan and said, "Brother Lu, look, Atsu must be starving." Luchan spat and said, "Stupid dog, if there is a chance in the future, I will kill you and stew you." Exian was shocked, and quickly grabbed Luchan's hand and begged, Brother Lu, don't eat Atsu, it's very good." Luchan was pushed a few times by her and almost fell to the ground. He could only smile bitterly and said, I know, I was just joking with you." Only then did Exian cheer up. She smiled like a blossoming flower. Then, she found a white cloth to bandage Luchan's wound. At the same time she asked, "Big Brother Lu, why did you fight with that Miss Bai? She is different from me. She is the proud daughter of a real big family. Her family background is not bad, and I heard that Hakushin Jinkuin is going to make an exception and accept her as his third disciple. Why did you provoke such a person?" Luchan said impatiently, "First of all, I didn't know her identity at all. Second, I didn't provoke her, she was the one who looked for trouble with me." "I see." Exian thought for a moment and said, "Then it is Miss Bai's fault." Luchan looked at Exian and suddenly said, "Why do you trust me so much, including in front of Miss White Lotus? You didn't hesitate to say that you don't trust her. You scared me." Exian smiled and said, "Because I trust you. You saved my life and helped me a lot. If I don't trust you, who else should I trust? Besides, in that scene just now, Miss Bai was standing there, but you were lying on the ground with blood all over your body and bleeding from your chest. It would be strange if she didn't bully you. Could it be that you stabbed yourself in the chest? Lu Chen was silent for a moment, then nodded and said, "Yes, what you said is very reasonable." Although Exian was also a woman from an aristocratic family, she didn't seem to be particularly spoiled at the moment. She even helped Lu Chen to start cleaning the messy house, and then swept the rubbish into piles here and there, like a small hill of different sizes. Lu Chen coughed twice and called Exian back saying, "You've worked hard. You should take a rest first, the dust is too much, it's choking." Exian said, "Oh." She sat down with a red face, then looked at the empty house, frowned and said to Lu Chen, "Brother Lu, there is nothing in this house now, no one can live in it." Lu Chen said, "It's okay, I will find a way to add some things later. It shouldn't be a big problem." Exian said, "Then what about you and Atsu these 2 days?" Lu Chen said, "I'll sleep on the floor." Exian shook her head. Her hands didn't stop bandaging his wounds, and said softly, "So pitiful." Lu Chen laughed and patted Exian's head saying, "Have you forgotten the days we spent in the disorienting lands? We ate and slept in the wild every day. Wasn't it 10 times worse than now? Now at least we have a house to hide in." Exian glanced at him and said, "It's not the same." She thought for a while, then said to herself, "I'll still help you ask for a favor, see if I can really let you squeeze into the spirit cultivation, odd job disciple list. I heard that those who are qualified to be on the list will leave Stonepan Valley and go to another Baichaotang territory. The conditions there are much better than here, and you can get in touch with many elite disciples of the sect." Lu Chen suddenly felt a little moved, nodded and said, "If that's the case, then it's naturally the best, but..." He looked at Exian, a little surprised, and said, "You can even speak for such a big thing? I can't tell." Exian giggled and said, "That's not true. I'm just a new disciple who just joined the sect this year. How can I be qualified? But because I've been pretty miserable, so the elders and martial uncles of Baichaotang feel very sorry for me. If I try to please them, maybe I can help you." Lu Chen laughed and said, "Amazing, you've grown up." Exian's cheeks turned slightly red, and then she said, "Actually, it's them who pity me, not Halfway through her words, Exian suddenly froze, as if she suddenly thought of something. Her eyes fell on Lu Chen's face, and she seemed to be thinking about something. Lu Chen quickly felt Exian's strangeness and said, "What's wrong? Why are you looking at me like that?" Exian made a sound, looking a little hesitant, and said, "I just said that I trust you very much." Lu Chen said, I heard and saw it. Thank you very much." Exian said, "I also told Miss Bai that I don't believe that she said bad things about you. But in my heart, I clearly think that she hurt you." Lu Chen coughed and said, "Yes, you see, she can't refute it, so she admitted it." Exian looked at Lu Chen with a pair of bright eyes, and Lu Chen felt a little strange under her gaze, so he glared at Exian and said, "What are you looking at? Is there a flower on my face?" "No, there's no flower." Exian said, "Brother Lu, I just suddenly thought of it. At that time, I thought that it must be her fault, because no one in the world would stab themselves with a knife. Isn't it? But didn't I do that a few days ago?" Lu Chen was speechless. Looking at Exian's somewhat serious face, he smiled bitterly and said, What are you trying to say?" Exian stared at him, and said seriously, "Brother Lu, I definitely still believe you. I think you must be a good person. But now that I think about it, after seeing that scene, if it was anyone else in the world, it must be right, only you, I suddenly feel a little guilty in my heart." "Hey, what you said makes me feel very wrong." Lu Chen suddenly frowned and said angrily, "Why do I feel guilty when I look at you?" Exian looked at him and said, "Because you just taught me the same method. No one in the world will stab themselves with a knife, but it's different for you. When you first taught me that method, you said it so easily. Now that I think about it, even if you take a knife and cut yourself, you won't even blink." "Hey." This time, Lu Chen raised his voice, and his tone was full of annoyance. "Is there something wrong with your brain? You sound like I'm a crazy person." Exian stuck out her tongue and laughed out. It seemed that after thinking about it carefully, even she felt that it was a little unbelievable, so she waved her hand and said, Okay, I was just saying. Lu Chen glared at her and said, Don't talk nonsense. Exian shrugged her shoulders, stood up and said, I know, I just said it casually, look at how anxious you are. The name list for spiritual power cultivation is currently being discussed. I have to quickly go back and ask for a favor for you, to see if we can squeeze a place in. You just wait for my good news. Lu Chen agreed and said, Okay. After a pause he said, But you don't have to worry too much, do what you can. If you really can't ask for it, I will think of other ways, don't force yourself. Exian smiled and said, It's okay, I understand. As she said that, she walked towards the door, and deliberately turned to Atsu, patted its head, and said a few words, then opened the door, turned around and waved to Lu Chen, and said, Brother Lu, I'm leaving. Oh, Lu Chen responded. The door was closed. After a moment, suddenly the door opened again, and Exian poked her head in, and said to Lu Chen, Brother Lu, just now you really didn't use a knife to cut yourself? Get lost. Oh, Exian's head shrank, and she stuck out her tongue, then she smiled and left. Chapter 109. Ah, it's quite comfortable. Lu Chen let out a sigh of admiration and closed his eyes. At this moment he was in Old Ma's Black Hill Pavilion in Kunwa City. There was not a soul in the shop, but there was now a bamboo recliner. He was lying on the recliner, and his head naturally swayed forward, making creaking sounds. Sitting next to him, Old Ma was very proud and said with a smile, Of course. This chair was made by Mingji, the shop with the best bamboo rattan craftsmanship in the city. I spent a lot of money to buy it. Lying on this bamboo chair, I feel like I'm floating in the air or floating on the surface of water. It's really comfortable. Spent a lot of money. Of course. Lu Chen opened his eyes, looked at Old Ma, and said sternly, You always say that you're going to die of poverty, but you still have money to buy this kind of extravagant thing. It's obvious that you're lying. Old Ma sneered and said, Is a reclining chair made of bamboo an extravagant thing? Cut the crap. I'm going to die of poverty recently, so I brought some spirit stones to help me out. Old Ma spread his hands and said, I don't have any. I bought this chair with the rest of my money. Lu Chen cast a sidelong glance at Old Ma and said with disdain, Shameless. Old Ma shook his head and said, How much is a kilogram of face worth? How many spirit stones? The morals of the world are degenerating day by day. Lu Chen closed his eyes and said with emotion. Old Ma clicked his tongue and said, Are you short of money recently? Lu Chen said, Didn't I tell you? That girl, Exian, is helping me with the spiritual power cultivation. I can't just let her do it alone. I'm thinking whether I should give her some spirit stones or not. Old Ma thought for a moment and said with some doubt, You helped her a lot before, and with Exian's temperament, will she accept your money? Lu Chen said, I don't think so. Old Ma's face darkened, and he said angrily, If you don't know how to accept it, then why are you asking me for spiritual stones? Lu Chen sneered and said, I said you're stupid and you don't want to admit it. Do you understand the ways of the world? Whether she accepts it or not is her business. Whether I give it to her or not is another matter. Old Ma frowned and thought for a while. He murmured, Now that you mention it, it seems to make sense. But why do I always feel that you want to make money from me? Despicable. Lu Chen sat up and pointed at Old Ma. He said sternly, Despicable. Old Ma was speechless. I've secretly inquired about the cultivation of spiritual power. It's true. Old Ma chased Lu Chen down from the bamboo lounge chair, and then threw his fat body onto the chair. Suddenly, there was a loud squeaking sound, and then the chair swayed back and forth, making him squint his eyes in comfort. At the same time he said, Although this job is still a handyman, it can be regarded as one of the best jobs among the handyman disciples. Indeed, there are many people who would break their heads to get involved in it. Speaking up to this point, he stretched out a fat finger and shook it at Lu Chen. In my opinion, a useless person like you with no identity, no status, and no background will not be able to compete with others. I'm afraid you're going to let down the E family's little Mississippi. Luchan walked to the door and leaned against it. He turned back and smiled. I'll give it a try. Anyway, I won't lose anything. What if I really get selected? Old Ma sighed and said, Do you really want to go? Luchan did not answer his question. He only said slowly, The cultivation of spiritual power is for the most outstanding disciples in the sect to cultivate spiritual materials. It will be useful to get in touch with the outstanding young disciples of the Kunlun party. Old Ma closed his eyes and was silent for a moment. He said, Okay, I'll think of a way. Luchan looked at him and said, Damn Baldy. If he was in the Kunlun mountains, these things would be so easy to handle. Why would he stay in the immortal city all day? Old Ma suddenly smiled bitterly. There's something going on there. What's wrong? Old Ma was silent for a moment. His voice suddenly became much lower. He said, Last month, just the news from Fuyunji said that 7 more shadows had died. Lu Chen's expression did not change. However, deep in his eyes, his pupils seemed to contract slightly. He slowly turned his head and looked at the small alley outside the door. He saw that on the quiet stone road, the gray brick walls were mottled everywhere, and in some of the cracks and on the top of the wall, there were still clumps of green weeds growing tenaciously, adding a bit of life to this lonely and cold alley. A breeze blew. The weeds in the secluded and dark places swayed their stems and leaves. His clothes also swayed slightly with the wind. The wind was a little cold. After a while he said softly, Is it just the number reported by Fuyunji? Old Ma nodded. Yes. It's just that Fuyunji reported the number themselves. No one knows how many there are in private. What are Fuyunji and the others afraid of? They're afraid of gossip, they're afraid of mockery, and they're afraid of the pressure from the undercurrents in the Immortal Alliance. Lu Chen snorted. That Dambaldi is one of the 6 true monarchs of the Immortal Alliance. His status is extremely high. As long as he supports Shuang, I don't believe that anyone would dare to touch Fuyunji. Old Ma smiled helplessly. Ordinary people naturally can't do it. But if the other 5 true monarchs say it, then it's different. Lu Chen's expression suddenly changed. His originally calm expression finally changed. Who is it? The Kunlun mountain range was majestic and undulating. In the deepest part of the mountain range, there was a vast area that was covered in thick fog all year round. It was almost connected to the white clouds in the sky. Even if there was a strong wind, it could not blow away the fog. Between the clouds in the sky, there were 4 huge mountain peaks floating in the void. They were the most famous and illustrious peaks of the Kunlun party, the 4 peaks of the sky vault in clouds. These 4 peaks were thousands of feet away from each other. Separated by the clouds and fog, one could only vaguely see the shadows of the other peaks. It was as ethereal as a fairyland, as if it was the place of the celestials in the human world. The 4 peaks had been passed down since ancient times. Although they were all on the same mountain range, they each had their own strange phenomena. They coincided with the cycle of heaven and earth, and the 4 seasons. Hence they were named according to spring, summer, autumn, and winter. The spring peak was full of vitality. The summer peak was scorching hot as if it was in a fire. The autumn peak was cold and lonely with a murderous aura. The winter peak was a world of ice and snow. Everything was desolate. The 4 peaks in such a close distance actually had such a magical phenomenon. It could be said to be a miracle of creation. In the Kunlun party, the 4 peaks of the sky vault and clouds had always been an important place in the sect. Historically, only the most important people in the sect could step on them. Ordinary disciples did not even have the right to go near them. On this day, the winter peak that was suspended high in the sky was still the same as before. It was a world of ice and snow. The white snow covered the sky, and the whole peak was pure white. The strange thing was that the other peaks not far from this peak, including the peaks of the Kunlun mountain range below it, were still full of green. It could also be considered a kind of wonder. The strong wind was fierce, blowing like a knife. The cold air seemed to be able to penetrate through the flesh, and directly into the bones. It made people want to shiver uncontrollably. On the winter peak, There was a figure standing on the edge of a cliff formed by solidified ice. It was an extremely beautiful little girl of about 10 years old. It was White Lotus. At this moment, her face was cold. She was wearing a cloak. When the cold wind blew, her beautiful hair fluttered along with her clothes. She really had a kind of ethereal fairy's aura. However, she did not have the slightest bit of the fierce appearance she had when she was fighting with Lu Chun. Not to mention the strange situation where her hands were stained with blood. It was as if she was another person who had nothing to do with her. Or perhaps, no one knew which was the true face of this young girl. Her face looked a little pale. It was unknown whether it was because of the unusually cold temperature and the strong wind on the winter peak, or because she was not feeling well. However, standing at the top of the winter peak and looking down, there was a feeling that the vast Kunlun was under one's feet. The world seemed a lot smaller. Even the clouds in the sky. How could they not be under one's feet? The sound of footsteps suddenly sounded, shattering the falling snow and ice on the ground. A figure appeared behind White Lotus. It was an old man. If Lu Chun was here, he would have recognized this person. It was Zhuo Xian, who he had seen at the mountain gate of Kunlun, who had led White Lotus up the mountain. He was also the second disciple of the legendary Hakushin Jinkuan. At the same time, he was also an extremely powerful member of the Kunlun party, Jin Dan Friar. Zhuo Xian walked to the back of White Lotus. His eyes were as sharp as lightning, sweeping across the seemingly delicate girl in front of him. A strange light flashed in his eyes, and there seemed to be a trace of complicated emotions flashing across. White Lotus turned around and saw Zhuo Xian. For some reason, there was still no smile on her face. It was as if she had always had that kind of cold temperament since she was young. She lowered her head and bowed to Zhuo Xian, saying, "Second brother." Zhuo Xian nodded, then said calmly, "The strong wind here is cold. Your cultivation has not been completed, so it is not advisable for you to stay here for long. Otherwise it will easily damage your foundation. Follow me back." White Lotus lowered her eyes and said, "Yes." Zhuo Xian led her, and turned to walk. Along the way, they saw that the ice prism was strange and abrupt, crystal clear. It was as if they were in a magical and magnificent crystal-like world. The two of them walked through this magical snowy peak that floated in the sky. There was only the never-ending whistling of the cold wind in their ears. "Brother." White Lotus suddenly opened her mouth and called out. Zhuo Xian said, "What?" White Lotus said, "This time when will Master wake up?" Zhuo Xian's footsteps paused for a moment. Then he looked up and saw that at a place thousands of feet above them, at the peak of Winter Peak, endless wind and snow surged wildly, completely wrapping that lonely peak into an indescribably huge snowy fortress, as if it was far away from the human world. "I don't know," Zhuo Xian said calmly. What is it? Is there something?" White Lotus' hand that was wrapped in the cloak moved a little, gently holding the emerald green pendant on her chest. The warm feeling was as usual. Even in this harsh world of ice and snow, she seemed to be able to feel a sense of vitality and warmth from the emerald green branch. But it still felt like something was not quite right. White Lotus was silent for a moment, then said softly, "Nothing, just asking." Zhuo Xian looked at her, made a sound of then continued to walk forward. The wind and snow swept past behind them, rolling up thousands of snowflakes, painting the white peak with a layer of blurriness. Chapter 110. In the front hall of the Black Hill Pavilion in Kunwu City, Old Ma didn't immediately answer Lu Chen's question. His face looked a bit unsightly. After a while Old Ma said in a low voice, "More than one." Lu Chen's surprised expression slowly calmed down, but the light in his eyes grew sharper. After a while he suddenly laughed and said, "Damn Baldy, you've offended everyone, haven't you?" Old Ma shook his head and said, "There's nothing we can do about it." When the devil cult was at its peak, His Excellency was in the limelight. In Zhangxianmeng, he could summon the wind and summon the rain. 10 years ago, after the battle in the desolate valley, his reputation reached its peak, suppressing the other true monarchs to the point where they didn't have any face and offended many people. Lu Chen said, "Damn Baldy is so powerful. Why isn't he arrogant now?" Old Ma coughed and said, "The world has been in turmoil for a long time. Many people in Zhangxiameng still want to live a peaceful life." Lu Chen nodded and didn't say anything. He just looked at the alley outside, his eyes drifting. Old Ma glanced at him, and a trace of worry flashed across his eyes. He said, "In Zhangxiameng, Supreme Guangbo controls the financial power of the Immortal Alliance. He has always disliked Fuyunji, and has been complaining about it for many years. Other than this lord, the Heavenly Law Hall's Iron Pot Immortal has also expressed his dissatisfaction with the Floating Clouds division." His harsh words and stern countenance were directed at Hall Master Shuang. However, everyone in the entire Immortal City knows who the target is. Lu Chen was slightly surprised. He frowned and said, "Tiahu? Isn't His Excellency known to be impartial and impartial? Why did he also come to join in the fun?" Old Ma smiled bitterly and said, "Because Fuyunji has a lot of problems that can't be settled. Every 2 or 3 days, a shadow would either die or go missing on patrol. No one would be able to take it. It's only because true Lord Tianlan supported Shuang that Hall Master Shui would have been captured and sent to the Heavenly Law Hall." Lu Chen's face turned ugly again. He coldly snorted and said, "The evil faction has become so arrogant?" He paused for a moment, then shook his head and said, "That's not right. Although those lunatics are not weak, they are not strong enough to challenge Zhangxiameng directly." Old Ma was startled. "What do you mean by that?" Lu Chen turned his face away and looked at the empty alley outside. He seemed unwilling to say more and said, "You know what I mean." Old Ma hesitated for a moment, but he suddenly stood up from the comfortable chair and walked to Lu Chen. A rare serious expression appeared on his face and he said in a low voice, "This is a serious matter. I can't make wild guesses. No one in the world has a deeper understanding of the evil faction than you. If you have any opinion, you must clearly explain it to me. Then I can report it to the Supremes." Lu Chen did not speak, and only glanced at Old Ma. Old Ma sighed and said softly, "This is a serious matter. Besides, you should know in your heart that he doesn't trust many people. But he will definitely listen to what you say." Lu Chen was silent, and seemed to be thinking about something. After a while, under Old Ma's anxious gaze, he faintly said, "The evil faction has indeed infiltrated the Immortal Alliance. But Fuyunji is one of the Immortal Alliance branches that have fought against the evil faction the most over the years. Regardless of strength, experience or defense, they are all extremely strong. To be able to force Fuyunji to this state and lose so many people, the evil faction can't do it." Old Ma stared at him and said, "Then who is it?" Lu Chen suddenly smiled and said, "Whoever understands the Immortal Alliance the best, the one who is the easiest to attack, the one who benefits the most from the deaths, the one who jumps the highest and shouts the loudest, that is it." Old Ma's face suddenly turned pale. He stared at Lu Chen for a long while and finally said bitterly, "But you don't have evidence?" "I don't. Just guessing." "Just guessing? Such a big matter. I'm afraid you can't convince the public with just guessing. What's more, your words also implied those too. How can this be criticized with empty words? Since when do you need evidence in your eyes?" The room suddenly fell into silence, and no one spoke anymore. After a long time, it seemed that time had frozen in this lonely alley. When the light fell on them, the 2 ordinary figures under the ordinary eaves seemed to be just inconspicuous ants in the passage of time. "This can't be done." Old Ma softly broke the silence. "Why? What kind of people are those 2? Milord is already in a difficult situation. How can he make more enemies?" Lu Chen expressionlessly said, "You want me to speak," I said. "Whether you want to pass these words to the damn Baldy has nothing to do with me." Old Ma suddenly raised his head and looked at Lu Chen. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. A trace of a complicated look flashed across his face. In front of the alley, the silence was still there. The light and shadow changed, and the grass trembled in the wind. Lu Chen suddenly walked out of the gate, and came to the opposite wall of the alley. He reached out and broke a blade of grass. The cool breeze blew slowly, dancing alone in this corner that seemed to be forgotten by the bustling city. "Do you really think so?" Old Ma's voice sounded behind him. Lu Chen fiddled with the blade of grass in his hand and said calmly, "Yes." Old Ma walked in front of him and stared into his eyes, saying, "But I feel that there seems to be another meaning in your words." Lu Chen slightly narrowed his eyes and said, "Oh, what is it?" "It has the intention to kill the heart." "I don't understand. Speak human language. Do you still bear a grudge against Milord and want to harm him?" The breeze alley was silent again, as if there was a sudden clap of thunder. The green grass was quietly broken at the fingertips and drifted away with the wind. The clouds were gone, the sky was shining, and the alley was deep and dark. Only two figures stood under the wall. The breeze seemed to become lighter and slower, but it still blew tenaciously, sweeping up the hem of their clothes, but the palms in the sleeves could not be seen clearly. There was suddenly a sense of desolation in the wind. Lu Chen turned around and plucked a green leaf, saying lightly, "You should not say this." "I know." Lu Chen's fingers gently stroked the green leaf, his eyes bright and sharp with a bit of coldness. Even his voice seemed to be a bit colder, saying, "To say it in front of me is to suspect me. To say it to the bald head is to drive a wedge between us." The corner of Old Ma's eyes seemed to twitch, but he did not speak, just kept silent. Lu Chen said again, "You and I have known each other for 10 years. You should know me very well and understand my feelings, in fact." Old Ma suddenly interrupted him and said coldly, "In fact, I can't see through you at all. I don't know what you are thinking. Have you really let go of the things that happened 10 years ago? No one in this world will really know your feelings." Old Ma said each word slowly but clearly, staring at Lu Chen's eyes. His eyes were as sharp as a knife, as if he wanted to cut open the deep darkness in Lu Chen's eyes. There was a wind blowing, and the clothes were fluttering. Lu Chen slowly turned around and looked straight into Old Ma's eyes. The two men silently but coldly stared at each other. In the depths of his sleeve, an emerald green leaf suddenly withered and turned into a withered leaf. Then it silently slid down to the ground. "You think too much." After a long time, Lu Chen suddenly laughed, clapped his hands, and then glanced at the sky. Seeing the blue clouds leaving, he said calmly, "You asked me and I said it. You are not satisfied, so you suspect me. I am afraid this is a bit inappropriate." Old Ma was silent and did not answer. Lu Chen patted his shoulder and said, "Come on, fatty. In our line of work, there are people who are paranoid, nervous, and afraid all day long. In the end, there are also many who go crazy. If you go on like this, you will inevitably become a madman in the future." Old Ma closed his eyes, took a deep breath, then nodded and said, "What you said is reasonable. I was too impatient today. I'll pass on your words later." Lu Chen turned around and walked into the house, saying, "Whether to pass on the words or not, it is up to you." Old Ma followed behind him. After 2 steps, he suddenly said, "You saved my life. I have no intention of harming you." Lu Chen's footsteps paused, and he said, "I know." Taking another step forward, Lu Chen said, "Fatty, in these 10 years, my life was in your hands." Old Ma was silent. Lu Chen looked at the door that was close at hand, stopped and did not go in. After a moment, he turned around and looked at Old Ma, saying softly, "It is the same now." Old Ma's body slightly shook, then a deep and complicated look flashed in his eyes. After a moment, he nodded and said, "I know." Lu Chen smiled gently and said, "Well, it is late. I am going back to the mountain." Saying this, he waved to Old Ma, then turned around and walked out of the alley. Old Ma stood on the bluestone road, silently watching the figure gradually go away, not saying a word. When Lu Chen's figure finally disappeared from sight, the fat on Old Ma's face suddenly shook a few times. At that moment, his body seemed to suddenly relax from an extremely tense state, and he let out a long breath. It was as if he had been holding his breath and hiding in the water for too long. He took a few deep breaths and wiped his forehead with his hand. Then he smiled bitterly and turned around to walk back to the house. However, he had only taken 2 steps when his body suddenly froze. He had come to a complete stop. After a moment, he suddenly walked to a place in the corner of the alley and squatted down. His white and chubby hands reached out from his sleeves and groped around the brick wall. Then he picked up something from the ground. It was a dried and charred leaf, curled up into a ball. Old Ma silently looked at the dried leaf in his hand, then raised his head to look around. The tenacious weeds growing in the cracks of the wall were slightly trembling in the wind, full of vitality, sprinkling green. In the quiet alley, a trace of haze suddenly flashed in old Ma's eyes. Chapter 111. On the Kunlun party's rocktop mountain, behind the majestic Grand Hall, there was a quiet hall built under pines and cypresses. Jindan Friar and Melaleuca Japonica often meditated here, when they had nothing to do. Few people came here. Under the green pines and cypresses, the quiet hall was very quiet. The shadows of the trees were reflected on the ground, swaying slightly with the wind. Occasionally, the crisp chirping of birds could be heard from the distant forest, as if there was an otherworldly celestial atmosphere. In the quiet hall, other than the white-haired but youthful Melaleuca Japonica, Exian was also kneeling at the side, carefully brewing tea, the fragrance filling the air. In a flash, the tea was ready. Exian held the cup with both hands and placed it on the table in front of Melaleuca Japonica, saying, "Uncle Master, please have some tea." The teacup was pure white, crystal clear like the first snow. The tea in the cup was clear and fragrant. One sniff was enough to know that it was a very precious tea in the world. Melaleuca Japonica took a sip, then nodded slightly and smiled at Exian. "Little girl, your cultivation is not yet complete, but your tea brewing skills are amazing." Exian giggled. "My family grew up planting spiritual tea. After a few generations, I dare not say anything else, but I do have the ability to brew tea." Melaleuca Japonica nodded. "That's true. Back then, your family's ancestor, Iu, was known as the Kunlun tea deity. He planted, tasted, and evaluated tea, all of which were peerless. That's why the E family passed down the family business. Even today, the E family's unique tea, Little Crane, is still famous. No wonder you are so knowledgeable in the tea ceremony." Exian blinked and moved closer to Melaleuca Japonica, whispering, "Uncle Master Yen, if you like Little Crane tea, I'll sneak some for you during next year's harvest, okay?" Melaleuca Japonica laughed. "You're such a crafty girl. Why not this year?" Exian pursed her lips and said, "Martial uncle, you're blaming a good person wrongly. It's not like you don't know that it's not easy to grow this Little Crane tea. The annual yield is at most 1 to 2 caddies. Even so, our Kunlun sect has set an annual quota of 70 to 80% of it as a gift. There are also some elders in the sect who like to drink tea. Not to mention Jindan cultivators like you. There are even a few Yuanying Taoist masters. Our clan does not dare to offend any of them." She spread her hands. "That's why when the new tea is produced this year, it'll be sold out in the blink of an eye. No matter how capable I am, I can't get more. Next year, when the tea leaves are harvested, I plan to sneak home and sneak into the tea fields to get some when it's dark." As she spoke, she looked at Melaleuca Japonica with innocent and pitiful eyes. Melaleuca Japonica chuckled and patted Exian's head. All right, I'm just teasing you." As he spoke, he suddenly noticed from the corner of his eyes that there was still an inch-long scar on the left side of Exian's pretty face. It was slightly red and seemed to be slightly abrupt. Her face darkened. Her fingers slid down and touched Exian's cheek. Exian seemed to feel something and shrank back. Melaleuca Japonica snorted coldly. Such a beautiful face was almost ruined. Come to think of it, he got off lightly. If I had known, I would have killed him that day. Exian lowered her head slightly, but quickly raised it again with a smile. "Forget it, it's all in the past. Don't be angry, martial aunt." Melaleuca Japonica's eyes were filled with pity. "You're so young, yet you suffered so much for no reason. It must have been hard on you." As she spoke, her eyes suddenly turned cold. "Just as you said, your family has been offering tea for so many years, and you've built many friendships. Yet, when you were in trouble, not a single person stood up for you. How infuriating." Exian sighed and said, "I did ask my father about this, but he also told me that this matter can't be blamed on anyone else." "What did he say?" Melaleuca Japonica was surprised. "My father said that although our family's tea is good, it's just a dispensable beverage. If you like it, you can drink it. If you don't, it's fine," Exian said. But when it happened, he senior brother was a genius with a bright future. His master, Dukanjinran, was a powerful Yuaniing enlightened master, and the first seat of the Heavenly Soldier Hall. He was highly respected in Kunlun, and even the enlightened master valued him. Under those circumstances, no one would go against them for some spiritual tea. My father said that it's hard to blame anyone. My father also said that our family's biggest sin is being too weak. Yanluo was silent. After a while, she let out a long sigh. Suddenly she laughed self-mockingly and said, "So, I am the most foolish one?" Exian left her seat and knelt in front of Melaleuca japonica. She kowtowed and said in a low voice, "Uncle Master, you saved me from danger. Exian cannot thank you enough. The entire family is deeply indebted to you. In the future, if Uncle Master has any instructions, Exian will do her best no matter." Yanluo waved her hand to stop Exian from speaking. Then, she pulled Exian up and said with a loving look in her eyes, "Just take care of yourself in the future. Furthermore, I'm not the only one who contributed to the outcome of that incident." Exian's expression changed slightly. She suddenly remembered what Lu Qin said to her. She was lost for a moment, but recovered quickly. She smiled at Melaleuca japonica. "But you saved me. Don't worry, Uncle Master. No matter what happens next year, I'll definitely get you some little cranes." Melaleuca japonica laughed and pulled Exian to sit next to her. She sighed. "Speaking of which, it's all your cheap Master Dongfang's fault. He insisted on taking you as his disciple even before he recovered. In the end, he still can't come out from his closed-door training. He left you at Bai Chao Tang's place and let others bully you." Exian shook her head and smiled. "You can't say that. I'm indebted to my master. Without him, I wouldn't have been able to go to Kunlun." "Pfft." Yanluo spat in annoyance and said, "That unreliable old man has never done anything serious all day long. If it wasn't for him trying so hard to snatch you away, I would have been able to bring you up the mountain." Exian exclaimed. "Ah, really?" Melaleuca japonica rolled her eyes at her. "Nonsense. Do you think I'm stupid? Why would I stand up for Dukanjinran and his talented disciple for no reason? It's because I can't take it." "Oh, thank you so much." Exian held Melaleuca japonica's hand and said with a smile, "It's a pity that our Kunlun party doesn't allow us to worship more than one master. Otherwise, I'd worship you as my master too." "You wish." Melaleuca japonica scolded with a smile. "But I've known that old man Dongfang Tao for many years. He's much stronger than me in terms of cultivation. If he didn't go into closed-door training to heal his injuries, I don't think those people would dare to bully you like this." Exian was taken aback. "Life and death are unpredictable? Isn't my master just recuperating in closed-door training?" Melaleuca japonica snorted, but there was a complicated look in the depths of her eyes. If it was just to heal his injuries, he should have come out long ago. But it took so long. There must be a problem. Exian was more and more surprised. "What problem?" Melaleuca japonica extended 2 fingers. "There are 2 possibilities. First, old man Dongfang's injuries are deeper and more serious than we know. Even he can't take it. If he hasn't fully recovered after so long, he's probably not far from death. Second," she shook her head, but lowered her voice and said to Exian, "I'm afraid he's found an opportunity. He's trying to break through to the Yuaniing realm." Exian suddenly stood up and exclaimed, "Yuan!" Just as she said that, Melaleuca japonica had already covered her mouth with her palm and pulled her back. She glared at her and said, "Don't say anything." Exian's face was filled with disbelief. She was filled with excitement and nervousness. Even her body was trembling slightly. She nodded repeatedly. Melaleuca japonica, then let go of her hand. Immediately after, Exian immediately covered her mouth with both hands, as if this was the only way to keep the secret. After a long while she seemed to have calmed down a little. However, she still didn't dare to move her hands away from her mouth. Through the gaps between her fingers, she asked Melaleuca japonica in a trembling voice, "Senior aunt, is this true?" Melaleuca japonica snorted. "I've already said that this is only my guess. However, I've known old man Dongfang for decades. I can tell what kind of person he is the moment he raises his but this time it's most likely. Exian covered her mouth tightly and giggled foolishly. Even her eyes were squinting as she watched. Melaleuca japonica glanced at her and couldn't help but shake her head. She also laughed. If that old thing is lucky and really breaks through that life and death barrier and advances to the Yuanying realm, then your good days will come. A Yuanying stage Taoist master, who could summon the wind and rain, move mountains and fill the sea, had supernatural powers that could penetrate the heavens and the earth. Since ancient times, he had been an immortal class figure, standing at the top of the human cultivation world. However, such a person and such a realm, among the hundreds of millions of cultivators in the past thousands of years, only a very small number of people could reach this realm. This was because when one tried to break through to the Yuanying realm from the Jindan realm, there was an extremely dangerous life and death barrier that was extremely difficult to break through. When breaking through to the next realm, there would be the hindrance of the heart's devil from the outer realm. It was difficult to succeed unless one had great perseverance or strong luck. That's great. Exian was excited for a while. She couldn't help but worry. She quickly put her palms together and closed her eyes to pray to the heavens. She said, "May the heavens bless Master. Bless that everything goes smoothly and that everything is stable and stable." Melaleuca japonica looked out of the quiet hall. Between the pine and cypress trees, the mountains in the distance could be faintly seen. The clouds were surrounded by celestial aura, but she didn't know who was hiding deep in the mountains. After a long time, Exian's voice suddenly came from beside her ear. She said, "Senior Aunt, I have a request. You're tuning in to the Echoes of the Heart YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.